cspan.org. We take you live now to a Senate Judiciary subcommittee hearing on drug cartels and border security. U.S. Border Patrol Chief Carla Provost is going to testify, along with Tucson, Arizona's Police Chief, about the situation they're facing. They answer questions from members of the Border Security and Immigration Subcommittee.
Insectos abren la flama. Según los estudios federales, la marihuana es más disponible por los jóvenes que la cerveza desde hace 30 años.
Good afternoon and welcome. Today's hearing is entitled Narcos, Transnational Cartels and Border Security. Today's hearing will provide an opportunity for us to look beyond our borders and examine the larger problems contributing to the crisis along our borders. If you've watched the news recently, you can see just how serious the crisis has become. Back in the time we had thousands of unaccompanied minors in the Rio Grande Valley sector, President Obama called that a humanitarian crisis. I think that would also describe what's happening today in and around Tijuana, the San Isidro Bridge, and we'll hear more about that. But as we know, there are currently thousands of Central American migrants waiting at our southern border trying to enter the United States. This is not a new phenomenon. Regardless of which party is controlled, Republican or Democrat, we've dealt with sudden influxes of migrants for decades. In the 1980s, it was the Mariel Cuban boat lifts. In the 1990s, the Cuban and Haitian influx. And just a few years ago, as I mentioned, 2014, we saw a surge of unaccompanied minors from Central America. So improving our border security doesn't mean just improving physical security along our border. It also means addressing the problems that bring them here in the first place. The mass movement of these migrants is only a symptom of a greater problem, one that I hope we will discuss in detail here today. One of the greatest threats to our national security is the trafficking of persons, drugs, and a range of illicit goods into the United States. There is no single point of origin for those crimes, and we see this flow stemming from around the world, from East Asia, Africa, Europe, and South America. Trafficking, of course, is big business, and unfortunately for us, they've proven to be pretty good at it. The proceeds from illicit drug sales are worth approximately $64 billion annually. That's billions, not millions. That money isn't fueling the U.S. economy. It's lining the pockets of criminals, the cartels, the narcos, if you will, and continuing to perpetrate this cycle. In short, I think they're winning in this effort, notwithstanding our efforts, notwithstanding the heroic efforts of law enforcement and other government officials, because frankly, Congress hasn't awakened to the real crisis and come up with a solution to deal with it at multiple levels. The drug cartels, transnational criminal organizations, and international gangs will stop at nothing to ensure that their business model remains intact and profitable, and that the international corridors for trafficking remain wide open. They are shrewd, they're adaptive, and they evolve. They use every tactic in the book to further their criminal enterprises, whether it's murdering government officials, regular folks, threatening people, intimidating people, rape, torture, slavery, fraud, peddling fake documents, money laundering. The list goes on and on and on. Not only are we dealing with ruthless criminal enterprises, we're battling enemies that are ever evolving, as I said, and constantly on the move. They are what I've heard referred to as commodity agnostic. They really don't care as long as they make money. And they don't care who they kill, who they hurt, or what the consequences of their criminal enterprise are. They spread terror. They prey on the weak, and they've taken control over large parts of Mexico and several Central American countries. We frequently see these criminal organizations preying on migrants headed toward this country's southern border. They'll offer to smuggle migrants or their children safely across the border in exchange for money. But as today's witnesses can attest, this safe journey is anything but. Too often these migrants are abandoned or crammed into the back of an 18-wheeler with a dozen other victims. I've seen it time and time again that these groups have absolutely no respect for human life. It's not just the people who die at their hands while attempting to enter the United States illegally. It's the poison that they import into the country. America's opioid crisis is being further fueled by the illicit narcotics being smuggled by these organizations. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid, is one of the deadliest drugs in the world, and its analogs are mainly manufactured in China and then smuggled into the United States by these organizations. The growing influence of cartels, gangs, and transnational criminal organizations has led to global and regional insecurity, and there's a need for increased security cooperation, to be sure, with our neighbors in Mexico and certainly Central America, just to name a couple. The United States needs to work with our international partners to develop a comprehensive plan to address these problems. This war on drugs, trafficking, and smuggling is one that affects all of us, and it's time we pick up our pace in dealing with it in a focused and hopefully successful way. Again, this problem does not begin or end at our borders. This is a global problem, but for our purposes, focus primarily on our countries to the south, but certainly the avenues available into the United States can be exploited by anybody who's got the money or the will to try to come into the United States illegally. So by partnering with governments in Asia, Africa, Europe, and Central America, we can begin to fight these cartels and take the money and the profits out of their sordid business. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about the scope of the problems. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is a lack of public awareness. This is not looking through a soda straw at what's happening at the San Ysidro Bridge at Tijuana. This is a much bigger problem, much more complex, and one we need to open that aperture, and you'll help us here today in trying to understand before we can begin to come up with solutions. Before turning to Senator Durbin for his opening remarks, I'd ask unanimous consent that Senator Grassley's opening statement for this hearing be included in the record, which it will be without objection. Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say to you and to the witnesses and the audience my apologies for coming in a few minutes late. I was on the floor for the farewell address of our colleague, Senator Nelson, and I'm sorry that I was not here at the moment I should have been. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this hearing. It was almost 10 years ago that I held my first hearing as the chairman of the Crime and Drug Subcommittee in this room. The subject of the hearing, the threat to the United States posed by the Mexican drug cartels. 10 years ago, we had that hearing. At this hearing, in March of 2009, I quoted a Justice Department report that concluded Mexican drug cartels are, quote, the greatest organized crime threat to the United States. So here we are 10 years later. How are we doing? Last month, the DEA's 2018 National Drug Threat Assessment concluded that Mexican drug cartels remain the greatest criminal drug threat to the United States. I closed my 2009 hearing by saying we must take action to reduce the demand for illegal drugs in the United States and stem the flow of illegal guns and money to Mexico. Democrats and Republicans must work together to find bipartisan, common-sense solutions to this challenge. Now, today, 10 years later, we are in the midst of a drug epidemic like we've never seen before. In 2017, drug overdoses in the United States killed a record 70,237 people. The deadliest drug we face is fentanyl. Last year, 28,466 overdose deaths involving fentanyl, an increase of more than 45% over the previous year. Much of this fentanyl comes from China through the mails, but fentanyl is also being shipped from China to Mexico before being trafficked across the U.S. border. The DEA has found that the cartels transport the bulk of their illicit goods over the southwest border through legal ports of entry, using passenger vehicles or tractor trailers. Yesterday, we had a hearing in the same room. The Customs and Border Protection Commissioner, Mr. McAleenan, told me directly in October of 2017 that his top priority was to secure the border with more drive-through inspection systems, which he characterized as Z portals. When I asked him what he needed to keep narcotics out of the United States and make us safer, he said technology and personnel. He did not say a wall. According to the Department of Homeland Security, these drive-through inspection systems, which Mr. McAleenan has referred to, examine 98% of all the rail cars passing into the United States, but only 18% of cargo, passenger vehicles, and sea containers combined. 98% of the railroad, 18% of the others. Yet the 2019 President's budget request included only $44 million for these systems. I asked Mr. McAleenan yesterday, what would it take? What do you need to put these portal systems in that basically scan these vehicles as they come through to try to detect contraband, drugs, people being smuggled, drug trafficking, human trafficking. What do you need? He said $300 million. That's a fraction of $5 billion that this president is demanding for the wall. And the administration, sadly, in its budget request, did not ask for any funding for additional customs officers, even though we clearly need more officers to detect drugs at the ports of entry and in international mail. It was about 6 months ago that I got off a plane at O'Hare instead of heading into Chicago, stayed out there at a postal facility and took a look at how we monitor the mail coming into the United States to try and detect drugs that are being sent by mail. And it happens every day. It's a good system, but it's not nearly what it should be, and the people there will tell you that. They work at it, and they catch some of them, but a lot of them are not caught. Instead, what the president is telling us now is we have to shut down our government if he doesn't get $5 billion for a wasteful, ineffective border wall. We need modern drug technology to stop the drug cartels from importing the poison that's killing our kids, not a medieval solution like a wall from sea to shining sea. This is a circle, too. They aren't just exporting drugs into the United States. We are exporting drugs and laundered drug money into Mexico. What have we done to stop the iron river of guns from the United States that arms Mexican cartels to the teeth? In 2016, the GAO found that 70% of crime guns seized in Mexico, traced through ATF's crime gun tracing program, came from the United States. According to the GAO, and I quote, most were purchased legally at gun shows and gun shows in the United States and then trafficked illegally to Mexico. The federal agencies with jurisdiction over the Southern Flow of Guns, or ATF, which enforces federal gun laws, and ICE, which enforces export laws and investigates traffickers and cartels. Are they doing enough? ATF and ICE have an agreement that governs their coordination on firearms trafficking from the United States to Mexico. But in 2016, the GAO found that there were shortfalls in information sharing and collaboration between ATF and ICE, and that improvement was needed. I'm going to be sending a letter to the General Accounting Office asking them to update their 2016 report and to expand it to look at firearms trafficking to Central American countries. I invite my colleagues to join me. Customs and Border Protection also play a key role here. The GAO found, and I quote, Customs and Border Protection's outbound mission is to facilitate the movement of legitimate cargo while interdicting the illegal export of weapons and other contraband out of the United States. However, in 2017, a CBP spokesperson said that outbound inspections are only conducted, quote, when resources permit. Why on earth doesn't this administration request more resources for outbound inspections to stop the export of deadly firearms from the United States to these Mexican cartels? One thing Congress should do is finally prohibit straw purchasing and gun trafficking under federal law. Right now, U.S. Attorney's Office have to prosecute those crimes as paperwork violations, which means most of them won't spend any time doing it at all. I've joined with Senator Leahy and Senator Collins on a bill that would create federal offenses with real teeth for this effort. During my hearing 10 years ago, we heard testimony about the smuggling of bulk cash and laundered money from the United States back to cartels. It's the circle. They export narcotics in the United States. We export we export guns and laundered money back into these cartels. We wonder why they're so powerful. According to the latest DEA drug threat assessment, the amount of bulk cash seized has been steadily decreasing over the last 8 years. DEA reports that, quote, large amounts of cash continue to be interdicted along major highway corridors, with the cash typically concealed in hidden vehicle compartments or among legitimate cargo. Again, there would be strong bipartisan support in Congress for more resources for outbound inspections if only the administration put as much priority on this effort as they do on a wall. There is more that Congress can do. In 2013, when Democrats controlled the Senate, we passed bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform. Do you know how much was included in that bill for border security funding? $40 billion. and over 60 senators voted for it. No lack of will when it comes to border security. Sadly, the Republican leaders in the House refused to even consider the bill. Earlier this year, we tried again. After we got the report from Mr. McAleenan and others, I worked with my colleagues on a bipartisan immigration agreement to include the border security provisions he'd asked for, increasing the funding for the Z portal scanning devices, port of entry infrastructure and personnel, funding for biometric entry and exit screening. On February 15th, a bipartisan majority of the Senate supported our agreement with this border security included, but it failed to reach the 60 votes it needed because the president opposed it. On the same day, a bipartisan supermajority of the Senate rejected the president's alternative bill. We've got to be honest about the challenges we face and smart about the way we use our resources to address them. I'll work with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to reform our broken immigration system and improve security. Reducing brutal cartel violence and smuggling will not be accomplished by a border wall or punishing innocent victims of cartel violence who are desperately seeking safety in the United States. We have to work to address the drug epidemic in our nation, stop the weapons and cash that flow south to cartels, and collaborate more effectively with regional nations to strengthen their economies and decrease cartel violence. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I was glad to hear that 10 years ago,
10.
you convened a hearing on some aspects of this same problem, but being an optimist, basically, based on what you were saying, I see some common ground for investing in scanning devices, customs officers, dealing with the straw purchasers and the bulk cash transfers across the border. I see some components of some legislation that we could work on together, like we've worked on criminal justice reform, which I hope is successful. But at the same time, I noted that during the Gang of Eight immigration bill, as you said, there were $40 billion appropriated for border security. And in the DACA proposal that got 44 votes, I think it was 25 billion. And I'm still confused about the fight over 5 billion. But I agree with you, it shouldn't be just about physical barriers. It should be about technology. It should be about personnel. It's more of a system is the way I tend to think of it. Maybe the chief will enlighten us further. I'm sure she will. So it's my pleasure to introduce our witnesses for the first panel. Mr. Kemp Chester is currently the Assistant Director of the Opioids Coordination Group in the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Before coming to ONDCP, Mr. Chester was a Senior Director for National Security and Intelligence at a private sector consulting firm in Washington, D.C. And before that, completed 27 years of service in the United States Army, ending his service as Deputy Director for Intelligence of the Americas Regional Center and Chief of the Office of Counter-Narcotics Worldwide. Janice Ayala is currently Director for the Joint Task Force Investigations at U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Prior to her current position, Ms. Ayala served as the Deputy Director of Joint Task Force West. She served as a special agent in charge for ICE Homeland Security investigations in my hometown, San Antonio, Texas, and at ICE headquarters as the Assistant Director of Domestic Operations. As the Assistant Director for Domestic Operations, Ms. Ayala oversaw the investigative efforts of more than 7,000 HSI special agents assigned to 26 SAC offices throughout the United States, including investigative matters relating to national security, money laundering, bulk and drug, cash smuggling, and human smuggling and trafficking. The third witness is familiar to the committee. She's been here before, Ms. Carla Provost, Chief of the U.S. Border Patrol at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Before her current position, Chief Provost has served in a number of capacities within Border Patrol, including as Field Operations Supervisor in the Tucson sector, Chief Patrol Agent for the El Centro sector, Deputy Chief Patrol Agent of the El Paso sector, and Assistant Chief Patrol Agent for the Yuma sector. Mr. Knierim, Paul Knierim, is currently the Deputy Chief of Operations for the Office of Global Enforcement at the Drug Enforcement Agency. Before his current position, Deputy Chief Knierim served as a special agent in the Denver Field Division and was also assigned to the Quito, thank you, Quito, Ecuador country office. Mr. Caniram also served as the country attaché in the Costa Rican country office and as the assistant regional director for the North and Central American region based in Mexico City. Thank you all for being here today. Would like each of you to provide us with your opening statement. We know we have a written document from each of you, so don't feel necessary to read from that or repeat that. That'll be made part of the record. Mr. Chester, we'll turn to you for your.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Durbin, and members of the subcommittee. Sir.
I need one matter of business. I need to swear you in, please. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony given before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. Excuse me, Mr. Chester. Please start again.
Yes, sir. Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Durbin, and members of the subcommittee, on behalf of Deputy Director Jim Carroll, thank you for inviting the Office of National Drug Control Policy here to discuss the threat posed to the United States by Mexican transnational criminal organizations and U.S.-Mexico cooperation to address drug policy issues in both countries. On February 9th, 2017, President Trump signed an executive order stating that transnational criminal organizations, including drug cartels, represent a threat to the safety of the United States and its citizens. Mexican cartels primarily derive their economic power from the production, movement, and sale of illegal drugs. Drugs provide the means for Mexican cartels to employ military-grade weapon systems, attempt to corrupt justice and security officials, and expand their territorial control in Mexico and in U.S. markets, making them the greatest criminal threat to the United States. In 2017, Mexican cartels cultivated 44,100 hectares of opium poppy and produced 111 metric tons of pure heroin in Mexico, smuggling the majority to the United States. Increasingly, Mexican cartels are pressing fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, clandestinely produced in China, into fake prescription pills and smuggling them across the southwest border. Mexican cartels also produce the majority of the methamphetamine consumed in the United States, and they facilitate Colombian cartel trafficking of cocaine, which is also increasingly affecting our communities. The two previous Mexican presidential administrations attempted to confront the internal security threat presented by Mexican cartels in their own ways. However, despite Mexico's best efforts, these cartels have exploited vulnerabilities in governmental institutions at all levels, allowing their economic expansion even beyond drug trafficking. The profit-earning potential of Mexican cartels exceeds the Mexican government's annual budget allocated to its homeland security, which amounts to less than 1% of Mexico's annual budget. The governments of the United States and Mexico have developed a common understanding of the impact of Mexican cartels are having on both countries, and currently view addressing this burden as a shared responsibility. ONDCP engages directly with the government of Mexico and as a participant in high-level bilateral meetings, including the Security Cooperation Group and the High-Level Dialogue on Disrupting Transnational Criminal Organizations. Moreover, the Trilateral North American Drug Dialogue, chaired by ONDCP and the Department of State, brings together the governments of the United States, Mexico, and Canada to expand counter-drug cooperation in North America and allows all three countries to cooperate closely on the TCO threat throughout the continent. In an effort to improve coordination between the United States and Mexico, ONDCP's work with its counterparts with the government of Mexico is focused on three primary goals. First, to complete what's called the Monitoring System of Illicit Crops in Mexico program in conjunction with the UN Office of Drugs and Crime to develop a shared understanding of the opium yield in Mexico. This will be the first crop yield study completed in more than 15 years. Second, to complete a program funded by the State Department Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs that provides legitimate technical validation of Mexico's poppy eradication progress. And third, to use these programs to establish an agreed-upon United States-Mexico poppy eradication program, a shared eradication goal, and a joint strategy for intelligence-driven eradication in Mexico. On December 1st, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador was inaugurated as Mexico's president, vowing to fight corruption and develop a new vision to improve Mexico's internal security. A few weeks prior to his inauguration, President Lopez Obrador presented his National Peace and Security Plan to address security concerns in Mexico, and one of the plan's 8 pillars is to develop a narcotics strategy. Although specific details of this narcotics strategy were not presented, we expect that it will contain concrete and deliberate measures to directly address the cartel problem that affects both our countries, and we stand ready to continue our close and productive relationship with the new administration in this endeavor. In closing, the dynamic nature of the illicit marketplace controlled by Mexican cartels demands that the United States continue to engage with Mexico to prevent the ongoing proliferation of illicit drugs that originate from or transit through Mexico. We cannot allow Mexican cartels to continue to contribute to the dangerous and often fatal effects of illicit drug use in the United States. We will continue to work with our international partners across the federal government and with our partners at the state, local, and tribal levels to reduce the availability of illicit drugs in the United States and decrease the profound effects they are having in our communities. The American people should expect nothing less from us. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chester. Ms. Ayala?
Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Durbin, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement enforces 400 federal laws governing border control, customs, trade, and immigration to promote homeland security. ICE has 3 primary directorates: Homeland Security Investigations, Enforcement and Removal Operations, and the Office of Principal Legal Advisor, employing more than 20,000 employees in over 200 offices across the U.S. and in 50 countries. Today, I will provide ICE's perspective on the challenges we face, the sophisticated smuggling threats on our southwest border, and some of what we do to address TCOs and their smuggling activities well before contraband arrives at our borders or enters into the United States. I am an HSI Assistant Director, serving as Director of Joint Task Force Investigations for the Department of Homeland Security. In 2014, former Secretary Jay Johnson directed a department-wide comprehensive security strategy to unify efforts across DHS components and commissioned 3 task forces: JTF Investigations, JTF East, and JTF West. East and West are geographically focused on the U.S. southern land and maritime borders and approaches. And JTFI is responsible for enhancing and integrating prioritized criminal investigations. To accomplish this, JTFI created and manages the DHS-wide nomination and selection process for Homeland Criminal Organization targets, which are the top transnational criminal networks impacting Homeland Security, and then coordinates the dozens of investigations and operations through national case management. ICE is the executive agent of JTFI, which consists of over 70 interagency investigators, officers, and analysts. As the largest investigative component within DHS, HSI conducts multifaceted international law enforcement operations and investigations to combat TCOs and prevent terrorist activities. The primary TCOs that threaten our southwest border are Mexican drug cartels, and over the last decade, the United States, working with Mexican counterparts, has had sustained success in attacking cartel leadership. However, these TCOs are highly networked, have built-in redundancies, and adapt daily based on intelligence of U.S. border security and law enforcement activities. Cartels move illicit proceeds, they hide assets, and conduct transactions globally. They transfer and launder proceeds by bulk cash smuggling, trade-based money laundering, funnel accounts, professional money launderers, cryptocurrency, and the misuse of money service businesses and emerging payment systems. Cartels exploit vulnerabilities in U.S. and Mexican financial systems and conduct layered financial transactions to circumvent regulatory scrutiny. The U.S. government has refined our ability to target money laundering and financial violations through interagency investigations, capacity building, financial sanctions, and direct engagement with at-risk financial institutions and jurisdictions. Cartels utilize transnational gangs for extortion, kidnapping, and for violent acts. In 2005, HSI established Operation Community Shield, an international law enforcement initiative to combat the growth of transnational criminal street, prison, and outlaw motorcycle gangs. In 2012, HSI worked with the Office of Foreign Assets Control to designate MS-13 as a TCO. It's the first criminal street gang so designated. We have assigned more than 1,500 special agents and almost 150 intelligence research specialists to Southwest border offices, and since 2005 to Border Enforcement Security Task Forces, to include 2 border tunnel task forces to provide a comprehensive regional response to border security and national security. HSI-led BAS are comprised of more than 180 federal, state, local, tribal, and international law enforcement agencies. Due to their success, the Jaime Zapata Border Enforcement Security Task Force was signed into law in 2012. Mexico has proven to be an outstanding partner in the fight against CCOs, so our attaché offices in Mexico City and throughout South and Central America utilize HSI-led transnational criminal investigative units, which are DHS-trained law enforcement counterparts with authority to investigate and enforce violations of law in their respective countries. These efforts, often thousands of miles from the U.S.-Mexico border in countries like Colombia and Panama, act as an outer layer of security for our southwest border. During FY 2018, HSI investigations led to 34,344 criminal arrests, which is an all-time high. It included the arrest of 3,600 transnational gang members, seizure of over 1 million pounds of narcotics. We made over 1,100 seizures for violations of export laws and seized over $1.2 billion in currency and monetary instruments. We also identified and assisted over 300 trafficking victims. Thank you for your committed support to DHS, ICE, and our missions, and your interest in these important issues, and I would be pleased to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Chief Provost.
Thank you. Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Durbin, it's my honor to appear before you today. This Saturday, December 15th, marks 8 years since U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was murdered by members of a cartel RIP crew during a gunfight in southern Arizona. These RIP crews patrol our border with Mexico looking for opportunities to rob illegal aliens and other drug smugglers. Agent Terry was a military veteran, a former police officer, and had served with the Border Patrol for over 3.5 years. His murder was a great loss for our agency and illustrates the dangers presented by cartels and their associates. Cartels and other transnational criminal organizations, or TCOs, are a threat to our national security and to public safety. TCOs maintain a diverse portfolio of criminal activity, including fraud, human trafficking, kidnapping, and extortion. They are heavily involved in all kinds of smuggling, moving people, weapons, cash, and drugs through sophisticated criminal networks. In fiscal year 2018, the Border Patrol seized more than $7 million in currency, more than 7,000 pounds of cocaine and heroin, and more than 450,000 pounds of marijuana. Methamphetamine seizures have increased 75% since fiscal year 15. And we have seen a 115% increase in fentanyl seizures between the ports just this last year. TCOs also maintain influence over U.S.-based gangs as a way to expand their domestic distribution process. This means TCOs not only present a threat at our borders, through criminal networks and alliances, they present a threat to the interior of our country as well. Although not all gang members are affiliated with cartels, last year the Border Patrol apprehended more than 800 gang members. That's a 50% increase over the previous year. This is in addition to the nearly 6,700 aliens we apprehended last year who have criminal histories, including theft, drug, and weapon trafficking, and violent crimes. TCOs conduct their operations without regard for human life. Money and power are their only motivation. These networks are commodity agnostic. They move people with no more care than guns or bundles of drugs. Desperate aliens who enter these networks are at risk of being beaten, assaulted, raped, and even killed on their journey to our border. TCOs are both motivated and they are ruthless. They may operate as businesses, but they do not play by the rules of law, and they are not bound by the bureaucratic impediments we sometimes face in government. They will stop at nothing to gain power and profit. They are agile and adaptable, willing to spend countless resources to maintain and expand control of their criminal enterprises. To address the TCO threat, we must have a united, comprehensive strategy and an aggressive approach across all levels of government. CBP must continue to work in conjunction with our law enforcement partners, including my colleagues represented on this panel today, to interdict illegal aliens, drugs, cash, and weapons at the border. This is a key component of U.S. border security and, by extension, our national security. Thanks to the support of Congress in the past decade, the Department of Homeland Security has deployed more personnel, technology, and tactical infrastructure than at any other time in our history. As TCOs continue to exploit the border environment for their own financial gains, we must continue investing in all of these tools in the highest priority areas along the border. Today, we have already begun upgrading old vehicle barriers to better impede illegal cross-border activities like drug running. We have also prioritized high-traffic locations that lack border infrastructure for deployment of new barriers, the latest technology, and additional personnel. We stand ready to execute and look forward to working with Congress on these priorities. My men and women on the front line are facing this threat every day. It is my honor to represent them in their efforts to make our country safer by bravely combating cartels and other TCO threats. When Border Patrol agents report to work, they have no way of knowing what they may encounter: a family lost in the desert or a cartel rip crew armed with fully automatic weapons. The job is unpredictable and it is demanding, but whether they are stopping criminals and narcotics or saving lives, the men and women of the Border Patrol are well-trained and effective guardians of America's front lines. I thank you for your time and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Chief. There is a vote on in the Senate, and so Senator Durbin's gone to go vote, and I'm going to go vote and turn the gavel over to Senator Cruz, who will preside, and we'll be back shortly. Mr. Knierim.
Good afternoon, Chairman Cornyn, Senator Cruz. It's an honor to appear before you today to discuss Mexican cartels, the extent of their efforts to manufacture, transport, and distribute illicit narcotics within the United States in our efforts to combat this threat. I've had the privilege of being a DEA special agent since 1991. When I reflect on those 27 years of experience, the sophistication and capacity of the Mexican cartels worries me now more than ever. Dangerous and highly sophisticated Mexican transnational criminal organizations, or cartels, operating in both Mexico and the United States have been and will continue to be the most significant source of illicit narcotics trafficked inside the United States. Whether it's heroin and synthetic opioids, methamphetamine, or cocaine, the Mexican cartels are the primary source of illicit drugs on our streets. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Mexican cartels has been the confluence of three things: the synthetic drug threat, the epidemic of opioid abuse, and the cartels' attempts to expand their profits by intentionally mixing fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances with heroin, counterfeit prescription drugs, and other illicit drugs, including cocaine and methamphetamine. This is done for one simple reason: greed. This is a national threat, a public health emergency fueled by fentanyl, which is cheap to make, hard to detect, and dangerously potent. Chinese and Mexican nationals are increasingly operating in concert, resulting in an alignment responsible for the proliferation of heroin, fentanyl, and related synthetics coming across the southwest border. Coupled with the fact that a kilogram of fentanyl can be purchased for less than $5,000 from China, potential profits from the sale of that kilogram can exceed $1.5 million. The cartels are deliberately seizing on the suffering of thousands of individuals to generate profit. Aside from the proliferation of heroin and synthetic opioids produced by Mexican cartels, these same organizations continue to transport methamphetamine and cocaine across the southwest border at an alarming rate. We cannot afford to lose focus on cocaine and methamphetamine. The cartels are responsible for the production and trafficking of record amounts of methamphetamine entering the United States. Recent increases in coca cultivation and cocaine production are particularly troubling and likely foreshadows an increase of importation, abuse, and overdose deaths in the United States from these substances as well. DEA anticipates that Mexican cartels, such as the Sinaloa Cartel, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG, the Juarez Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, the Los Zetas Cartel, and the Beltran Leyva organization will continue to be the primary networks operating in more than one country to plan and execute their criminal enterprise. These Mexican cartels do not observe boundaries or laws in Mexico, the United States, or any other country. As you know, in 2016, Mexico extradited El Chapo Guzman to the United States, and just recently his trial ensued in the District of New York. We've already heard one of El Chapo's top lieutenants testify to the Sinaloa cartel leaders' extensive, lucrative, cruel, and ruthless operations. The details of his testimony further highlight the ability of the cartels to influence legitimate professionals such as accountants, attorneys, notaries, bankers, and real estate brokers who cross both the licit and illicit worlds and provide services to legitimate customers and criminals across the globe. This is why we partner with my colleagues at the table before you today, as well as with our state, local, tribal, and international law enforcement partners, especially Mexico. Let me also briefly mention my gratitude, as well as that of all of DEA, to our Mexican law enforcement, military, and security counterparts with whom we have partnered and many times have made the ultimate sacrifice. Our shared goal of protecting citizens from harm and keeping these destructive substances out of our societies is what unites us together in partnership. This leads me to what DEA is doing to counter the threat. We recognize this will take persistent efforts across a broad spectrum to include interagency and global partnerships. For decades, we have maintained a worldwide presence to address the source of drugs, and in this case, we have a robust presence and critical partnership in Mexico. In Mexico, DEA continues to synchronize and expand capabilities to combat the growing epidemic. We have developed a bilateral heroin strategy for intelligence sharing, coordinated investigations, training, increased sharing of forensic information, and the control of precursor chemicals. We participate in the North American Drug Dialogue, along with federal government officials from Mexico, Canada, and the United States that focuses on building a strategy to attack the production, trafficking, consumption, and misuse of illicit narcotics in North America. Defeating Mexican cartels and the opioid epidemic will require a community of effort at every level, state, local, federal, and with our dedicated international partners such as Mexico. DEA will continue to aggressively pursue criminal trafficking and illicit drugs. Targeting the world's most prolific and dangerous drug traffickers is a dynamic and evolving mission, and with it comes myriad challenges. Throughout our history, DEA has aggressively met those challenges and produced impressive results. We look forward to continue to work with you and your Senate colleagues to identify the resources and authorities necessary to complete our mission. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before your committee on this important issue, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. And let me say thank you to each of the witnesses. Thank you for your service. Each of you works in an incredibly difficult and important job, and we are grateful for the hard work you put in. Mr. Chester, let's talk about fentanyl for a minute. Fentanyl is killing Americans each and every day. Can you tell this committee where it comes from and how it makes its way into the United States?
Yes, Senator, and you're absolutely correct. What we have seen really over the last 2+ years in the United States is the rise in the prevalence and the lethality of fentanyl in U.S. communities, to the point that it has outpaced heroin and all other drugs in terms of mortality in the U.S. The fentanyl seen in the United States primarily is manufactured in China. And it is not only the base fentanyl molecule itself, but CBP has encountered up to 33 different analogs of the fentanyl molecule, also produced in China and shipped into the United States. There's really two primary routes. The first one is individuals who get on the internet, usually on the dark web, using cryptocurrency, purchase it for themselves, for their own use, or for distribution to a small number of known users, and that generally comes in the country through the U.S. mail system or through express consignment carriers who are commercial carriers. The second way
What quantity are we typically talking about there?
Very, very small quantities, Senator, and so you're really talking 600, 700, 800 grams, and because of that, and because of its potency and its lethality, it's purchased at a very low dollar amount. So not only is it in a small package that's hard to detect, it's at a dollar figure that doesn't raise a lot of suspicion. So that's the one primary vector into the United States. The second one is up through Mexico, where finished fentanyl is purchased in China, sent to Mexico, and then either shipped as part of a polydrug load across the southwest border, mixed in and milled with heroin or inert matter like lactose south of the border, and then brought up and sold as synthetic heroin. Or the third way, what we're increasingly seeing is it's pressed into pills and sold as fake prescription opioids and brought in large numbers of pills across the southwest border. So there are several different vectors for it to get in the United States. We can very clearly see the public health effects that it has in the United States. And fentanyl and its analogs will continue to be a substantial problem in our drug environment in America.
How many deaths are we looking at on an annual basis from fentanyl?
So the most recent data that we have for in 2017 was 28,400 deaths, or about 9 per day. And that is what's termed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as synthetic opioids other than methadone, which is a category that's dominated by fentanyl and its analogs. And that is a 47% increase from the previous year.
And what's the role of the Mexican drug cartels in bringing fentanyl into this country?
Principally, their role is to purchase it from Mexico, from China, and then to process it there in Mexico and then bring it into the United States for distribution through their own cartel distribution chain, and then obviously to a face-to-face sale in the United States. One of the things that makes fentanyl so attractive for drug cartels is the low upfront price, and obviously the high profits on the far end. And that's whether it is mixed into heroin and purchased by an intravenous drug user, by a known drug user, or whether it is sold as a fake pill, sometimes to an unwitting individual who believes they're getting Oxycontin or Percocet, and they're actually getting fentanyl and a fentanyl analog pressed into pill form.
And do we have an assessment of how much money the cartels are making from this trafficking?
Trafficking as a whole?
Let's take fentanyl or overall, both.
Overall, and I believe it was Senator Cornyn who quoted the price of about $64 billion today, and that's absolutely within the realm of the possible. $64 billion. The drugs continue to be the most lucrative and reliable source of income for transnational criminal organizations in Mexico.
Chief Provost, thank you for your good work. I've gotten to know a great many of the men and women in your agency, and I'm grateful for their bravery and courage and their service.
Thank you.
Let me ask you, from your perspective, what additional tools are needed to slow down or stop this flow of fentanyl and other illegal drugs into the country?
Well, thank you, Senator. There are numerous things that we need. As you know, the border is very dynamic, and there is no one thing that it just seems to be that main issue that would stop it. We need, between the ports of entry in particular, obviously more technology, more detection technology. We need more men and women. I need more canine handlers as well. We utilize them quite a bit. And, of course, I do need more barrier, because that does impede and deny, and it does prevent the entries. At the ports of entry, there was discussion earlier, and my colleagues over there are expanding their non-intrusive technology, which we also utilize at our checkpoints, and that certainly assists us as well. But it is a no one-size-fits-all. It's a mixture of all of those things.
Now, one of the tools you mentioned that you needed was more physical barriers, be it a wall or other forms of physical barriers. As you know, we're in the midst of vigorous debates right now in the Senate. Let me ask you, in your professional experience, what is the impact of a wall or physical barrier, and what are the benefits of it?
Personally, and just to keep it on topic with cartels, when I was an agent in Douglas, Arizona, east of Douglas one night there was a drive-through, as we call them, and we used to have numerous drive-throughs in the area. I was involved in the seizure of over 490 pounds of cocaine. Thankfully, the drive shaft on the truck broke as the vehicle was trying to get back south away from us. We had no barrier at that time along the border in that area. Once we put barrier in that area, those drive-throughs stopped. That is just one example when it comes to particularly narcotic smuggling. But as you know, Senator, the barriers are needed for impedance and denial. Technology provides a completely different capability for us. It provides situational awareness, and we certainly need that as well. But if we can't impede and deny, when we're talking about a 2,000-mile border and a very difficult terrain to work in, then the situational awareness lets me know something's crossing, but it sure doesn't stop it from crossing.
So in terms of technology, what have you all found is most effective, being it a virtual barrier, being infrared, fixed wing, rotary wing aircraft? What has the greatest positive impact enabling you to most effectively do your job?
Because of the diversity of the border, we find a mixture of all of those things, and it truly depends upon the area. When we are talking about areas with quick vanishing times, obviously having camera technology so that we can see. When we work in the remote areas, more detection capability is necessary for us. We have been expanding our tools in our toolkit and have found that having a diverse toolkit is critical for us to be able to deploy the appropriate resources in the appropriate location.
Ms. Ayala, can you describe the extent of the violence perpetrated by Mexican drug cartels, both in the United States and in Mexico?
Well, I would say that Mexican cartels and cartels in general have become more and more violent. They follow a pattern of violence, and then when certain federal officials are sent to certain areas, then the areas calm down and they're discouraged from violence in order for them to pursue their trafficking activities throughout the border area, south of the border. On this side of the border, I think we saw a lot of violence as far as in 2005 in the South Texas border, and then later on with some murders, and then later on what we saw was mostly the purchase of weapons to smuggle to the Mexico in order to engage in extortion and other assaultive and violent actions and torture on the Mexican side. What we see also now is that the cartels are using MS-13 and other gang members for kidnapping and extortion and other violent crimes that fall under the RICO statutes. And that's why.
To what extent is that crossing north of the border into the United States?
Excuse me?
To what extent is that crossing north of the border into the United States?
Well, as far as when we're talking about the gang piece, to put in perspective, we have about 100,000 MS-13 gang members in the Northern Triangle, and more than half of them are in El Salvador. 15,000 are in jails, 30,000 in the street. We have approximately 10,000 gang members here, MS-13 gang members here in the United States. And through our Operation Community Shield, the last 5 or 6 years, we've picked up over 8,500 MS-13 members, associates, and seized multi-ton quantities of, drugs and weapons and other violent implements, whether it be ammunition and so forth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz, for covering that while we were voting.
And we arranged for the protesters to occur while you were gone.
Good timing. So let me ask each of you, or anybody who has an answer, but not that long ago, the United States government decided we needed to do something to help the government of Colombia deal with the narco traffickers and cocaine in particular that was coming up into the United States, deal with things like cocoa eradication, but also to provide equipment and training for the government of Colombia. I was in Colombia about 4 months ago, and while things aren't perfect, they are far, far better. And I think most people who've paid attention would say that Plan Colombia was success. Nothing's 100% successful, and many challenges still remain. And President Duque, who is just recently elected, I know has made a commitment to more cocoa eradication than his predecessor had. But do we need a Plan Central America or Plan Colombia or something like that, Mr. Chester?
Yes, sir. I can start off, and then other members can add if they'd like to. You're absolutely right on the success of Plan Colombia, and I think Plan Colombia really combined two things. The first thing was the physical eradication of coca manually and aerially, and that was incredibly important at going to the manifestation of the problem, and it also built the capacity of the Colombian military and the Colombian police forces to be able to deal with the problem on the ground. what we have in Mexico is the Merida Initiative. And the Merida Initiative has been the primary vehicle, and it's administered by the Department of State with its 4 pillars in order to build strong communities, build institutions, build capacity, and go after transnational organized crime. Since its inception, almost 10 years ago, the Merida Initiative funding has been about $1.3 billion to the government of Mexico, and it's made a substantial difference in Mexico's capability to be able to deal with this problem as a partner. A lot of the activities that we have with the government of Mexico in terms of the professionalization of their military forces, the training and capacity building for their police, all the way to things like prison reform and transitioning to the new criminal justice system, including one of the programs that I mentioned in my opening statement, are funded through the Merida Initiative. And that is a very important component of what we're doing with Mexico. It's not exactly analogous, but it follows the same model of being able to handle the physical problem on the ground and then build capacity of the forces themselves.
The rest of you have a comment about that, Chief?
Just to comment, sir, you're exactly right. Working with our partners in Central America is key. We continue to expand our footprint to assist, whether it's, in this case, talking about the cartels and the narcotics that are coming into this country. We rely heavily on our relationships. Much like we do in Mexico, it is critical that we do continue to expand our efforts in Central America as well.
Mr. Kinnear?
I would just echo what has been said. I think the bilateral relationships and partnerships that we're able to develop and really lead to a joint, focused, integrated effort to address the threats, and things like the Merida Initiative and others that really do bring a coalition together in order to build capacity, as well as strengthen those relationships and partnerships. So while you're working the investigations on the one hand, you're increasing your prosecutorial capacity as well simultaneously. So it really does provide a mechanism in order to further strengthen those joint bilateral efforts on an investigative and prosecutorial perspective.
Well, I share your support for the Merida Initiative, and I hope we can do more amidst what is pretty gloomy news in terms of how much geography in Mexico that the cartels control, the level of violence in Mexico that President Lopez Obrador said was going to be one of his top priorities. We've actually seen more people die of violence in Mexico since 2007 than have died in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq combined. I remember what happened after 9/11 when 3,000 Americans died in New York and in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon. We went to war against al-Qaeda and the Taliban, but 72,000 Americans, or roughly 70,000 Americans have died from drug overdose, all this flood of heroin and methamphetamine coming across the border. It just doesn't seem like we've become desensitized to the outrage that really represents and the threat it represents to our national security. So I know Senator Feinstein, obviously coming from a border state, has talked to me about working on something like a Central American plan. I know President Obama, under his administration, had a plan to try to support the triangle of countries in Central America. I know we need to figure out something more than just sending money. We need to find out what works, and that's the reason why I mentioned Plan Colombia. I think there is a lot of interest. On the bright side, amidst, as I said, a pretty gloomy prospect in terms of Central America and in large parts of Mexico, I was encouraged to see what the incoming administration in Mexico, I would happen to be down there for the inauguration of President Lopez Obrador, and I know that Secretary Nielsen and other members of the administration have been directly negotiating with the incoming administration on how to deal with the asylum issue. Mexico, for the first time to my knowledge, has begun issuing work permits, offering asylum in Mexico. Of course, many of these individuals want to be reunited with their family in the United States, so they're turning that down and saying, I'm going to go to the United States. But the agreement to allow those claims to be processed while the applicants remain in Mexico, I think represents a major change in policy and perhaps will provide some level of deterrence to the efforts many have come from Central America across Mexico and the United States. Do you have an opinion on that, or Chief Provost, can you perhaps provide a little color for what I've tried to describe?
No, certainly, Senator. Our relationship with Mexico right now has been an outstanding relationship, and considering all that we are dealing with on our shared border, it is critical going forward that we continue down that path with the relationship we have. Our partners in Mexico have been doing as much as they can with the limited resources that they have as well, and have been great partners.
Well, given our history with Mexico, they're a little skeptical of the United States, as you can imagine. We've taken a substantial piece of Mexico and made it Texas and other parts of the Southwest. And I agree with the characterization you and Mr. Chester have made that this has to be a shared responsibility, because I think trying to do this to our friends in Mexico or for them will not be well received. And so I'm actually encouraged by seeing this very modest step in terms of the asylees, the claims for asylum coming from Central America. And I'm hopeful that with the new administration, we can develop those sorts of relationships and develop programs that we can work on together, and would certainly welcome any input, insights, advice you might give us in doing that. Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Chief Provost, how important is the export of firearms and drug money from the United States to the Mexican cartels to their continued existence?
Well, so certainly, Senator Durbin, the money, as you mentioned earlier, that is going back into Mexico and into the hands of the cartels is of great concern for us, as well as the weapons. We do run operations along the border routinely. We do bilateral operations with our partners along the Mexican border, as well as outbound operations to do our best with the resources that we have to address the issue.
Let me be more specific. How frequently are vehicles traveling southbound across the border through ports of entry checked for illegally exported weapons?
I would have to defer to my partners in the Office of Field Operations for exact numbers on that.
Would you defer to them and let me know what they say?
Yes, sir. We'll get back to you.
I'd appreciate that. Is it a priority?
It is a priority, sir.
Have you
CBP.
witnessed the seizure of weapons headed from the United States down to Mexico?
Yes, I have, and my Border Patrol agents also assist with outbound operations on numerous occasions, and we have seized weapons, and we have seized money going south.
You might have heard my earlier testimony about Z portals. Are you familiar with that technology?
Yes, sir. We utilize those as well in the Border Patrol.
Pretty amazing. Would you describe those to the committee?
It is a non-intrusive technology that supports our ability to inspect vehicles and cargo that are coming through both the ports of entry and at our checkpoints.
It's kind of like an X-ray or scanning device, as I understand it?
Yes, sir.
Non-intrusive?
Non-intrusive, sir.
And what do you learn from the use of that kind of technology?
Well, that technology has helped us in seizures, both at the ports of entry and between the ports of entry at our checkpoints. The technology is one capability or one resource that we utilize in our toolkit to support our efforts as we do our best to address the issue of all of the narcotics coming across the border.
Are you troubled by the fact that fewer than 1 in 5 vehicles are subject to that sort of scanning as they head north?
I can't speak to the exact numbers, sir, that are scanned at our ports of entry. I would take that as a get back with my partners in Office of Field Operations. I do know that they continue to expand the amount of technology that they are deploying at the ports of entry, and they continue to request more of that technology.
My guess is, and you defer to your field people again, if they could tell us their numbers. We have 18% of vehicles searched by this non-intrusive scanning device, and a request from at least Mr. McAleenan last year, that was his highest priority. That's why we included it in our bill. My guess is that those vehicles headed southbound, even fewer are being scanned for weapons headed from the United States down to these Mexican cartels, and I'd like you to be able to produce, if you can, information on Z portals being used for those exporting weapons and contraband from the United States to the cartels.
Yeah, I will take that as a get back.
And Mr. Knierim, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Yes, sir. Good. You had some testimony here that you said in your testimony, seizures of smuggled bulk cash decreased from $437 million in 2016 to $193 million in 2017. That means the smuggled bulk cash, which we assume is somehow associated with drug trafficking, decreased by 56%. You also say that the gross amount of bulk cash seized has steadily decreased since 2010. To what do you attribute this decrease? And is it possible that it's a sign that the cartels have found a more sophisticated way to transfer their laundered money?
Well, I think one thing I would like to highlight is the significant efforts that are being undertaken in order to investigate money laundering and the transfer of illicit proceeds. There are many different tactics and techniques that the cartels use, and we likewise are available to utilize several investigative tools. I think there are obviously a lot of efforts being made to continue to identify the bulk currency that is being moved south. We also recognize that there are additional technologies and virtual currencies that are being implemented by some of the trafficking organizations in particular as it's going forward.
The point I want to get to is the one I opened up with. What I've just described, scanning these vehicles as they're coming into the United States, 18% are being scanned, scanning the vehicles that are headed south from the United States with weapons, contraband, money, having the means to deal with the technology by which they are now transferring this laundered drug money back into the cartels to make the next round of narcotics and to strengthen themselves, has nothing to do with a wall. Nothing to do with a wall. Sign me up for more money to address the things I've just described to you. Don't sign me up for a $5 billion wall that was supposed to be paid for by Mexico. And if I could ask one last question, is that okay?
Senator Durbin?
He's signing me up, yes.
I was wondering if I could address that last question as far as the new techniques. While TCOs continue to use bulk cash smuggling, armored car services, and the exploitation of financial systems, utilizing funnel accounts, correspondent banking, and other financial fraud and trade-based money laundering, they're also utilizing stored valued cards. And there's been a significant increase in money laundering using cryptocurrency-related financial investigations. We've more than doubled our seizures since last year. We also have seen a lot of Chinese TCOs that are obtaining financial contracts to launder narcotics proceeds from Mexican TCOs, and they're employing traditional methods such as money pickups and then structuring through casinos, banks, and wires. We're also seeing, which is of concern to us, and we're investigating Chinese counterfeited foreign documents. They're being shipped in bulk to Mexico, and they're provided to TCOs to create financial accounts or to register businesses, which makes it more difficult to see true beneficial ownership.
What you're telling me is the sophistication of the movement of this money goes way beyond bulk cash. And
absolutely.
They're smart enough to know this isn't working very well.
Absolutely.
We've got to be just as smart with the right people and the right technology. The last point I'll make, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your willingness to let me say a word here. When I went to that postal facility, that CBP facility at O'Hare Airport, those are good people. They're doing the best they can. You wouldn't believe all the junk that comes through the mail into the United States, and a lot of it is just trash and junk, but some of it has to be carefully inspected because it contains narcotics, fentanyl, and the rest. We need a better system, and we need a lot more people. That's not a wall. It's putting in technology and personnel to effectively deal with the threats to the United States. And I think fentanyl is one of the most dangerous threats. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chief, just let me start on this, the last point that my friend and colleague Senator Durbin made. Are there some places along the border where a physical barrier makes sense as part of a system?
Yes, Senator, there certainly are.
And as I recall, back in 2006, Congress passed on a bipartisan basis a Secure Fence Act, which authorized 700 miles of fencing, and that passed on a broad bipartisan basis. Has most of that been constructed so far?
Yes, sir, the vast majority of it has been.
So in some places, physical barrier does make sense. make
Yes,
that point.
it does, and if I may.
Yes.
In relation to technology and personnel are definitely necessary as well, but one does not replace the other. We need the ability to impede and deny. The technology helps us on the detection, and of course, our men and women and the resources there support our efforts when it comes to having enough people to make the apprehension or make the seizure. I would liken it to the Ring doorbell. The doorbell is great technology, that Ring doorbell and the ability to be able to see somebody that comes up to steal a package off of your porch, but it does not prevent them from stealing the package off of your porch. You need the impedance and denial, and that is what a barrier brings for us. And then you need the law enforcement personnel, as you have both stated, to make the arrest or to make the seizure.
Thank you for that. So I just want people to understand, I think every one of us have some sympathy and certainly empathize with people who are experiencing violence or lack of economic opportunity, jobs in their home countries, and who want a better life. That's just the human condition. But are the same people, the same narco traffickers, the same human traffickers, the same people who facilitate the transit of migrants from Central America through Mexico into the United States, are they the same ones that are importing heroin and methamphetamine in the United States?
The cartels own the plazas and run the areas along the entire border, and they may not always be the ones that are moving them through. However, the alien smuggling organizations have to pay a fee to move people through those areas, so they work hand in hand with each other. And if I may just address the fact that, Senator, you mentioned it before, the very dynamic situation and when it comes to the people. I've said this before and I'll say it again. Our men and women do not check their humanity at the door. They have a very tough job to do, a very tough mission dealing with both a humanitarian and a law enforcement mission, and I'm very proud of what they do.
Well, we thank you for saying that. I think you speak for all of us. But the point I want to make is that the same transnational criminal organizations that traffic in drugs, traffic in women and children for sex slavery, are the same ones that move the migrants across the border from Central America, correct?
They certainly have involvement in the movement of the migrants, yes,
And
sir.
it's all about the money, right? It's it's their business model.
It is, and as I stated in my opening statement, unfortunately, they do not treat the migrants, the people, any different than they do the drugs or the money.
And to Senator Durbin's point, the same sort of technology that the commissioner talked about yesterday that you were discussing that can identify the movement of people, drugs, and other contraband coming north, if there was sufficient numbers of them and we had the infrastructure in place that would allow it, that could also scan vehicles heading south containing bulk cash and weapons. Is that correct?
Yes, there is the potential to use it in that.
But as I understand it, the priority has been on traffic coming north, because we're talking about the drugs again and the other contraband and illegal immigration. And so there hasn't been deployed the sort of resources in terms of manpower or technology for traffic heading south.
My colleagues, specifically at the ports of entry, my colleagues, as you both know, have a very difficult mission in that they have a law enforcement mission, but they also have a mission to facilitate lawful travel and trade. And they focus their resources, of course, on inbound. However, they do deploy as much as they can to outbound operations as well.
But they have to have priorities given limited resources.
Yes, Senator.
And you've answered this at another hearing at another time, but I just want to reiterate this. The caravans of migrants that are showing up at San Isidro Bridge in Tijuana, and which are showing up every day in what I would call a mini caravan, roughly 400,000 people detained at the southwestern border in fiscal year 2017, tens of thousands of unaccompanied children and family units. Do the cartels use them as a strategic diversion so that they can then tie up Border Patrol and other law enforcement authorities and then use that gap to exploit the importation of illegal drugs in the United States?
Yes, Senator, that is a tactic that they have used over the years, and certainly with the influx that we are having in regard to this humanitarian issue, they most certainly use that as a diversion for us, as my men and women are spending a large majority of their time dealing with the humanitarian effort. It takes them away from their border security mission. And the cartels, the TCOs, know that, and they use it to their advantage.
Ms. Ayala, this is my final question. Senator Durbin was discussing how creative, and you were discussing how creative the cartels have gotten when it comes to money laundering. And it's not just bulk cash coming across the southwestern border through Casas de Cambio and other entities. Is it possible for the cartels and other criminal organizations simply to wire money back to Mexico and Central America, because without identifying who is sending it? In other words, are there other tools or authorities that our law enforcement agencies need in order to stop that? And is that a problem? The reason I ask is because I know tens of billions of dollars of remittances are sent each year back from the United States back to the home countries of people who come to the United States. And I just want to ask you whether that's a vulnerability in terms of creative money laundering or wiring money back to the home country.
I think one of the biggest vulnerabilities as far as money laundering is concerned is correspondent banking and some of the rules and regulations that we have as far as depositing money in the name of a bank account or a bank instead of in the name of a business, which is what's happening in many high-profile cases that we're working. Trade-based money laundering, having the tools to really work on commercial fraud and making that a priority, as much of the money that is laundered through legitimate trade. They're involved in cryptocurrency, as we talked about, and some of the lack of transparency and beneficial ownership as far as corporations makes it difficult for us to really ascertain what true ownership there is in a business and be able to seize assets. So I think capacity building overseas with our partners and training, building their capacity for financial investigative efforts and their ability to engage in asset forfeiture would be, I would think, would give us the biggest bang for our buck.
Thank you very much. Senator Durbin, do you have anything else for this panel? Thank you all for being here and helping us understand this problem and providing some good answers and food for thought for further action. There is another vote on, so we'll excuse the first panel. We'll go vote and come back and take up the second panel. Thank you. We'll be in adjournment.
Just want to get there's room. Will you save our seats? We'll be back. If you can. Okay, let's go finish the video. And you guys decide next week. There'll be room. Yeah, we'll get you something to eat. I mean, I'm hungry, but I can still wait. I'm going to pass out. Okay, well, we'll get you something to eat. And then we'll go to his office real quick and see what committee's on tomorrow. And then or you might want to go there now, because they're going to leave probably at 4:20 or 4:30. Okay, we'll go. There'll be someone there at 6. Yeah. Okay, I'll go to you, get to me, and then to his office. Wait, thank you, Paul. Or you can call him too. No, I want to go in. Oh, I see what you're saying. You can call him. That's what I do. Let's just see.
This Senate Judiciary subcommittee hearing on drug cartels and border security is taking a short recess. In the meantime, we'll show you a portion of today's Washington Journal.
Joining us now from Dallas, Texas, to discuss the current relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, Robert Jordan served as a former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia in the President George W. Bush administration from 2001 to 2003. He's also the diplomat in residence at the Southern Methodist University Tower Center for Political Studies. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
How would you scope out the relationships between the United States and the Kingdom these days?
I'd say it's probably at its lowest point since 9/11. It's a very serious situation that we find ourselves in, an ally perhaps gone rogue. And so I think we're scrambling to try to figure out how to deal with this Crown Prince, how to rein him in, and what it means for the future of the relationship. But it's deeply troubled right now.
That the Senate is planning votes concerning not only the war in Yemen, but the relationship, or at least interest to kind of address the relationship overall. What do you think that says about the appetite of this government to say, or at least make a statement about Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think it's encouraging that the Senate is taking up where the executive branch has failed. We are seeing now some leadership from the Senate, particularly Corker, Graham, and some others. And I think it's very important to realize that we have three branches of government here. The Senate has been relatively silent lately in foreign affairs, and I think they are realizing now that Some elements in President Trump's administration don't seem to be interested in the kinds of values that America has stood for throughout its history, and they are now standing up to that.
What's your perception as far as the president's current support for Saudi Arabia?
It's mystifying to me. He seems to think that there's simply a binary choice here. Either you condemn and completely eliminate the relationship, or you stand solidly by this Crown Prince. There are many, many areas that constitute a middle ground here. That's what diplomacy is about. And diplomacy should be used here to modify the behavior, to condemn the murder, to condemn any kinds of rogue activities, which would include a senseless war in Yemen, a blockade of Qatar, kidnapping the Prime Minister of Lebanon, and so many other things. So this is a range of activity here that needs to be dealt with the Saudis, and they need to understand, and hopefully the adults in the room in Saudi need to understand, that this young Crown Prince is simply off the rails.
This is Ambassador Robert Jordan joining us, and if you want to ask him questions about the current relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, Independents, 202-748-8002. You can also send your tweets at C-SPAN WJ. Ambassador, you were ambassador to Saudi Arabia at September 11th. How would you characterize the relationships then to now?
Well, we certainly reached a low point after September the 11th. I arrived in Riyadh about a month after the attacks of 9/11. And the question then was, were the Saudis friend or foe? Were they behind the attacks of 9/11? And I spent a great deal of time trying to get that sorted out, including dealing with then Prince Salman and now King Salman. They were in denial. They refused to admit that Saudis were involved for quite a period of time, and we had great difficulty in getting their cooperation on counterterrorism. We finally turned a corner with them, and they became a solid ally within a few months after that. And so I think to compare to today, we have to have tough diplomacy today as well. Unfortunately, for 2 years, we have not had an ambassador in Riyadh. And so we haven't had someone on the ground day to day in their face, reminding them of what our alliance stands for and what the values that we hold so important really constitute. Thankfully, the President has now identified General John Abizaid to be nominated as ambassador. I know him well. I think he is a superb choice, but we need him on the ground promptly, and I hope the Senate will confirm him promptly.
So if that should happen, what would be the direct line of statement that the ambassador should make to the Saudi Arabian government concerning our current relations?
Well, I think he needs to be quite vocal that the kind of conduct we have seen from this Crown Prince is not consistent with an alliance with the United States. I think we have many tools in our toolbox to sanction this kind of activity. He certainly wouldn't unilaterally be able to implement them, but he can certainly make it clear to the Saudis that going forward, we have an alliance that's important. But the alliance is with Saudi Arabia, not personally with MBS. And I think it's important to deal at many levels of the Saudi government that can help influence the conduct of the government going forward.
Before we take calls, could you briefly scope out how we ended up as an ally to Saudi Arabia, particularly in Yemen?
Well, the alliance goes back to 1945 between King Abdulaziz and Franklin Roosevelt. We have had an arrangement for so many years that we would basically provide a security umbrella in exchange for uninterrupted flows of oil from the kingdom. We have felt that it's important to protect Saudi Arabia's territorial integrity. The Houthis have conducted raids along the Yemen-Saudi border for many years. They have been an adversary of the Saudis and an adversary of the puppet government that the Saudis installed in Yemen more recently after the Arab Spring. And so we've supported efforts to resist the Houthi takeover of Sana'a and other parts of Yemen. The Iranians saw an opportunity to come in, and so our grand strategy of resisting any incursions by Iran fit in well with Saudi national interests in resisting the Houthis.
Again, Ambassador Robert Jordan joining us. Our first call for you, sir, comes from Maryland. Democrats line. Jeff, you're on with our guest. Go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thanks a lot for C-SPAN. So I was hoping you would clarify what all the tension is between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and how that sort of complicates the efforts to sort of navigate foreign policy in the Middle East and what the implications are for our connections to other Arab countries in that region.
Good question. The Saudis and the Qataris have had significant animosity over the years. Qatar has resisted the Saudis as being the 800-pound gorilla in the Gulf. Qatar has supported the Muslim Brotherhood, including the Brotherhood's attempt to take down Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, the installation of Morsi, and then the resistance that the Muslim Brotherhood has demonstrated to the royal families both in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And so Qatar has been viewed as a destabilizing influence by the Saudis and the Emiratis. They have supported Al Jazeera, a newspaper that has been pro-Iranian and very anti-Saudi over the years, and a television station there as well. They have given refuge to figures in Hezbollah and Hamas. And so the Saudis had made demands over the years that Qatar cease their support of these activities. Qatar refused, and so the Saudis instituted this blockade along with the UAE, Egypt, and Bahrain. And so this is a feud that has now risen to a significant level, and probably one that the Saudis and Emiratis would resist resolving over the near term. America has a significant interest in resolving this. Our largest military base is in Qatar. We need the Qataris to play a role in the Gulf, and they should not be driven into the arms of Iran right now or Turkey as a consequence of this blockade.
From Las Vegas, Nevada, Ron on our Republican line.
Ready?
You're on. Go ahead.
Yes, Ambassador. My attitude is this. During the course of the last administration, the entire Middle East became very chaotic, and a lot of problems have developed over that period of time. But it's my overall belief right now that the president is working very firmly to modify everything. And the way I look at it is that if we leave him alone and let him do his job, and he didn't have so much opposition, I believe he'll get it done. And the Saudis, of course, I have some mixed feelings about the Saudis because I believe there's a possibility that during the course of 9/11, that could have been an issue which they may have had a lot of responsibility for. I don't think that that's ever been proven. But the most important part, I think, that could happen right now is let the president do what he's attempting to do. And, of course, you mentioned a number of times what our values are. But those are our values. And the Middle East is an entirely different situation. Their values have nothing to do with us. What we need to do is take a direct hit on how to solve these issues, irrespective of what our values or their values.
Okay. Caller, thank you.
Well, I think the answer really depends on what it is you think the president is accomplishing with the Saudis.
An award in 2015, the Order of the Aztec Eagle, which is the highest order award granted to foreigners from Mexico's president and foreign secretary. Our second witness is the Honorable Roger Noriega. Ambassador Noriega is currently a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Prior to that position, he served as Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs and as the U.S. Ambassador to the Organization of American States from 2001 to 2003. While at the OAS, he worked with hemispheric leaders to strengthen democracy, advance human rights, foster economic integration, and promote peace and security throughout the Western Hemisphere. Ambassador Noriega has been involved in Latin American policy since the 1980s. Our third witness today is Professor Selena Relujo. I'll try, give it my best. Ms. Relujo is currently an adjunct professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. From 2002 to 2006, she served as the State Department Director of Counterterrorism Finance Programs at the U.S. Secretary of State's Office of the Coordinator for Counterterrorism in Washington, D.C. The professor is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and Women in International Security. The fourth witness is Chief Chris Magnus. The chief is Chief of Police for the Tucson Police Department, a position he's held since January 2016. Chief Magnus has served in many law enforcement capacities during his long career, including service in Lansing, Michigan, Fargo, North Dakota, and Richmond, California. Chief Magnus is an expert witness for the U.S. Department of Justice, working with the Civil Rights Division and the COPS Office on policing issues in various cities around the country. Welcome, Chief. Our final witness is Dr. Andrew Salih. Dr. Salih is president of the Migration Policy Institute, a position he assumed in early 2017 after serving as executive vice president of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Dr. Salih is a respected scholar and analyst of Mexico and U.S.-Mexico relations and a frequent commentator in the media. He's written and edited a number of books and policy reports on the U.S.-Mexico relationship and Mexican and Latin American politics. Thanks all of you for agreeing to be with us here today. Ambassador Wayne, let me start with you, please. Any opening statement you'd care to make? Red button, please.
The red button talk.
Perfect.
There we go. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you and Ranking Member Senator Durbin for your initial comments. You made a lot of the most essential observations that I was going to make, so I'll try not to repeat them. But you pointed out how both the U.S. and Mexico societies suffer from this cross-border illegal trade that's going on, the importance of making this a high priority. We've made a lot of progress over the last 10 years, but there's much more to do. Mexico's new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO, is beginning his 6-year term with a large mandate controlling both houses of Congress and wants to transform his country. He's made clear a number of times that he wants to find ways to cooperate with the United States. So both governments should build on what's been working so far while they explore new ways to make that cooperation better. We should definitely avoid what happened 6 years ago when there was about a year of freeze in the cooperation between the two governments during the last presidential transition. Teams from both sides should get together, review very thoroughly what's going on right now, what makes sense to continue, and also try to identify new priorities, especially that mesh with the public security strategy that AMLO has put forward in recent weeks. One thing we should try very hard to do is keep going after that business model of these drug groups. In 2017, the two governments agreed to do that, but we didn't get to go forward with that program very effectively. We should try and do so now. We have to keep working on better interagency coordination between the two sides and within each government at the same time. We should also, I think I very much agree with the comments of taking additional steps to manage the risks that are out there, including using this new technology that is available. And by using the MERITA program, we can make it available on both sides of the border. So we're really looking at all the entry and exit points, and we can share that data and analyze it with new IT software to be even more effective in tracking what's going across our borders. We should also look seriously at how we can support elements of this new public security policy. There are a number of parts of this 8-pillar approach that AMLO has presented that I think we can effectively support and work with them in developing. All of this effort needs additional funding, including additional MERITA funding, and I think that would be very well used. And I agree fully with the idea of taking AMLO up on his offer to develop a regional approach to this program that deals with causes as well as effects and takes that long-term and a multi-layered approach to deal with the problems of migration and crime. Congress has a vital role to play in this process in making sure this reinvigorated cooperation gets off to a good start and that we have sufficiently funded plans to take it forward. Over the past 10 years, bilateral cooperation has been under the umbrella of the Merit Initiative between Mexico and the United States. That initiative brought order, it brought more coordination and more funds to U.S. assistance. It helped build closer cooperation between law enforcement, justice, diplomatic, security, border, and intelligence officials on both sides, and it greatly improved capacity through the assistance programs that went forward. But more progress is needed. But I think what's important to understand is that all the people working on this came to accept that dealing with these problems are a shared responsibility. That was not the case 10 years ago. There was a lot of finger pointing. Right now, there's a great consensus that the way to really solve these problems is working together. We should make sure we can maintain that approach. As you and others noted, Senator, the opioid crisis has pressed us to realize how important this is. As I mentioned, in 2017, we got an agreement with the Mexicans on a new set of intense efforts to look at that whole value chain from production through financing at the very end and tried to cut it off in all angles. Sadly, we were not able to take that forward, and at least part of it was because there was a popular backlash in Mexico against the criticisms of Mexico and a number of the harsh actions on the border. I hope we can now take this opportunity to move forward and build that cooperation. Within Mexico, since 2014, as was mentioned, criminal groups have spread more widely their violent activities across Mexico, and they diversified the crimes that they are committing in Mexico. Very sadly, homicides reached a new record, violent homicides, in 2017, and it looks like there's going to be another record set when all the data's in for this year. Not surprisingly, then, a prime driver in electing López Obrador was insecurity. And not surprisingly, one of the first plans he's now presented is this 8-pillar approach. It's not exact overlap with our priorities, but there is a significant area where we could work together between the two governments. He has taken, in his 8 pillars, a look at preventive as well as enforcement issues, looking at causes as well as effects. If you would like to later, I could talk a little bit about those 8 pillars, but I won't go through them all now. I'll just mention that perhaps one of the most controversial parts of it is announcing the restructuring in public security. He's created a new public security ministry, which Mexico did have before, but then he's created a National Guard, which will be a military service or a militarized service under the Secretary of Defense. So there are a lot of questions about that still need to be explored and debated in Mexico. At the same time, popular expectations are very high. They welcome a fresh approach. So we need to work with the Mexican government and see how we can mesh these objectives together. Merit, as you mentioned, has been working for the past 10 years under its 4 main pillars. These pillars have been very flexible. They've allowed us to cover a wide range of different programs and to evolve priorities to reflect changes in the governments on both sides of the border as we're working this through. In my written testimony, I go through some 19 areas where I think there are good programs underway that would sync very well with the new priorities put forward by López Obrador.
Ambassador Wayne, let me ask, we were asking people to keep to the 5 minutes opening, and I'm fascinated to hear what you have to say. Let's follow up with some questions.
Okay.
Then proceed to Ambassador Noriega.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Senator Durbin, for the opportunity to discuss what's at stake in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. Mexican organized crime has grown as a threat in the last 20 years. Worse yet, it is part of a dangerous, sophisticated global crime network right on our doorstep. Mexico's new president, AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who won a clear mandate to fight corruption. However, his thoughts of subduing narco violence with an amnesty and anti-poverty programs are not reassuring. This matters because 90% of the cocaine and heroin entering the United States transits Mexico, sustaining a public health and criminal justice crisis that costs us $200 billion. The Mexican people complain justifiably about U.S. demand for drugs, which sustains criminals who sow terror, death, and instability. We must face this threat as partners because neither government can coexist with lawless groups that attack our people with impunity. Mr. Chairman, I've worked against this threat for about 2 decades, mostly in the U.S. Congress, congressional staff. And I believe this crisis is worse than ever in the supply and lethality of drugs, the depth, breadth, and wealth of the networks that deliver them, and the inability or unwillingness in certain cases of governments to attack them effectively. A few examples. Since 2013, the production of heroin in Mexico has tripled. The supply of fentanyl, which is 30 to 50 times more potent than heroin, has increased dramatically. Colombian coca cultivation has quadrupled, and potential cocaine production out of that country has tripled, reaching record highs and filling the coffers of Mexican traffickers. Deadly gangs from Central America, which are vertically integrated into every American city, are expanding their drug smuggling and distribution operations right to our border. Making matters worse, Mexican organized crime is part of a global criminal network with $2 trillion in annual income. That's the equivalent of Mexico's GDP, carrying that asymmetrical threat right to our doorstep. Every day, this criminal network does whatever it takes to optimize the supply chain of illicit drugs to the market here in the United States. Here's how we dropped the ball in the last 10 years, in my opinion. The Anti-Drug Alliance in South America that was really the work of George Herbert Walker Bush, which he helped pull together, has now fallen apart. We stood by as the last Mexican president failed to devise a strategy against the narco-traffickers, and his improvised response over the last 6 years has made matters worse. Leftist regimes in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, El Salvador, and Nicaragua hijacked their countries and switched sides in the war on drugs. A narco state in Venezuela has looted at least $350 billion in oil revenue, and it profits today from narco trafficking and money laundering throughout the Americas and in Europe. Venezuelan narcos use their billions to sow corruption and instability in the transit zones in Central America, the Caribbean, and in Mexico. Even in Colombia, where we invested $10 billion in aid and had trusted partners, leftist guerrillas secured a peace deal that produced an explosion of cocaine that I referred to, and armed smugglers that are thriving in Venezuela under the protection of the regime. China and Russia provide intelligence support, weapons, and banking ties that abet criminal regimes and profitable schemes. In this dangerous climate, we need Mexico to do more. But the new president's talk of fighting the drugs with an amnesty or social programs sounds like a recipe for surrender. Here's what we can do about it. During this transition in Mexico, we have to lock in the mutually beneficial economic and social security cooperation that exists today. The President of the United States should designate an ambassador to Mexico whose judgment and loyalty he trusts to maintain a candid dialogue on sensitive issues. We should encourage Mexico's president to fulfill his anti-corruption mandate by imposing the rule of law and overhauling Mexico's police and criminal justice system. Congress should quickly approve, our Congress should quickly approve, in my opinion, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement to secure export markets and U.S. trade ties that produce jobs for the United States. On the international front, we should work closely with the new government of Brazil to restore a regional anti-drug alliance. We must increase asymmetrical measures to attack the transnational organized crime threat. More investigators, more prosecutors, more intelligence, and more legal authorities are needed to sanction and punish kingpins and choke off cash to their criminal operations. We should work with our neighbors to confront the narco state in Venezuela and dismantle its criminal network. We should continue to help Colombia eradicate coca and secure its border with Venezuela. And finally, we should investigate expose and counter activities by Cuba, Russia, and China, abetting trafficking and other criminal activity in the Americas. We have a lot of work to do, obviously. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Professor Relujo.
Thank you, Chairman Cornyn, Ranking Member Durbin, for the opportunity to appear before you today to testify on the threats posed by Mexican TCOs to our national security and U.S. and Mexican efforts to counter them. Mexican cartels are engaged in a variety of illicit activities that includes drugs, arms, human trafficking, kidnapping, extortion, and money laundering. They thrive in a culture of corruption and impunity in Mexico, and they use violence and the threat of violence to empower and enrich themselves. They've also capitalized, sadly, on America's voracious appetite for drugs such as heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, and methamphetamines. The national opioid epidemic, fueled by heroin and fentanyl, coming mostly from Mexico, is significantly impacting the public health, economy, and national security of the United States. In 2017, the National Security Strategy recognized transnational organized crime as a threat to U.S. interests both at home and abroad. It emphasizes the need to secure our borders and pursue transnational threats to their source. The U.S. and Mexico enjoy one of the most extensive bilateral military and law enforcement relationships in the world that illustrates the concept of defense in depth, which means working with our international partners. Through the 2008 Merida Initiative, the U.S. has helped to build the capacity of Mexican authorities through more effective poppy eradication, monitoring, detection, and interdiction operations, border security, extradition cases, and anti-corruption programs. For over a decade, the Mexican military has been deployed in the streets of Mexico in law enforcement missions, but the violence continues and it's actually escalated. Mexico had a record number, to complement Ambassador Wayne's testimony, of 31,174 homicides in 2017, which represents a 27% increase compared to 2016, and we anticipate the year's end to actually reflect even higher numbers. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, assumed office on December 1st and has pledged to fight corruption and end the violence plaguing Mexico. These two priorities are reflected in his National Plan for Peace and Security 2018 to 2024. The new plan intends to reform Mexican security services by creating a National Guard to address crime and violence head-on. It's considering granting amnesty to low-level drug traffickers and legalizing marijuana and possibly poppy cultivation. This is quite divergent from previous Mexican government policies and from U.S. law enforcement and counter-narcotics interests. It's too early to tell if and how bilateral cooperation on poppy eradication, interdiction operations, and the fight against cartels will continue under AMLO. Regarding the Central American migration crisis, the U.S. and Mexico are trying to address the humanitarian crisis at the border and are considering requiring asylum seekers to stay in Mexico as they get processed through the U.S. court system. In the last 24 hours, Mexico has actually publicized their plan to create a Marshall Plan that would extend about $3 billion over the next 5 years in order to complement the assistance that the U.S. and other countries are granting to the Northern Triangle. And we're looking forward to hearing more details about that, what that would consist of, to deal with the root causes of the migration. The two countries must work together to protect our countries from drug, arms, human trafficking, money laundering, and corruption. One area where Mexico and the U.S. share interests is with regard to fighting corruption and money laundering that empower these cartels. AMLO's national plan includes a proposal to prevent and combat money laundering associated with crime and corruption. In its plan, it estimates that $20 to $30 billion a year could be recovered or seized. On this front, the U.S. should emphasize the importance of anti-money laundering efforts, not only to fight corruption, but the Mexican cartels, with the following 5 recommendations. Number 1, exploit financial intelligence in law enforcement operations against the cartels. Number 2, aggressively pursue the top cartel financiers, since their main objective is to maximize profits, and these financiers are very, very difficult to replace. Number 3, encourage improved coordination among prosecutors, the Financial Intelligence Unit, bank regulators, and law enforcement agencies in order to achieve more money laundering convictions and actually to deter criminal activity. Number 4, advocate for the swift passage of non-conviction-based forfeiture before Mexico's Congress, as well as beneficial ownership disclosures. And number 5, provide training and technical assistance for agencies that counter money laundering and promote better interagency within Mexico, but more importantly, international cooperation with our counterparts through information sharing. In conclusion, Mexican cartels pose serious threats to the public health, prosperity, and national security of the U.S. and Mexico. The two countries must identify common interests, build trust, and collaborate across the security, counter-narcotics, trade, and governance portfolios, and enhance foreign assistance programs that are already underway to directly counter the Mexican cartels. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Professor. Chief Magnus.
Chairman Cornyn and Ranking Member Durbin, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you. I'm the police chief for Tucson, Arizona, and I've been in policing for 40 years, 20 as a chief. I've always made it a priority to work towards strengthening police community ties. So I'd like to approach this discussion from a maybe slightly different angle than the other panelists today. Working in a large, diverse city located near the Mexican border, I understand the need for border security. I've seen how the transnational criminal organizations bringing drugs into the U.S. prey on immigrants to further their reach and increase their profits. There's obviously no simple solution for these problems. Improving border security and achieving community safety is going to require cooperation and trust between all levels of law enforcement, but just as critically between immigrant communities and the local police. The Tucson Police Department teams up with the feds to go after drug cartels, human and gun traffickers, and money launderers. This cooperation is essential to combat these threats. But at the same time, grant funding from the federal government serves as a critical resource to keep our communities safer. Now, earlier this year, the Tucson Police Department partnered with ATF and HSI to arrest 53 wanted violent and sex offenders. We also participated in an operation that included HSI and the DEA to target a heroin trafficking ring. In these instances, and many others, we've seen the benefit of partnering with each other. Many of my colleagues and I believe border security solutions must be strategic to address serious threats. According to recent stats from the CBP, more than 80% of hard drugs intercepted along the border are seized at ports of entry. Directing federal resources into improving staffing and infrastructure around ports of entry would be far more effective in halting the movement of drugs and guns across the border than simply constructing new barriers between these ports. Tucson is we're in the 6th largest county in the United States. Our Republican sheriff, who has the responsibility for policing 125 border miles, told lawmakers they'd be better off giving a fraction of the billions it would take to build the wall to law enforcement. He said, "I think it's kind of a medieval solution to a modern problem," and many of my colleagues and I agree with him. Demand for drugs in the U.S. drives trafficking, leading cartels to seek profits through victimizing the public on both sides of the border. We must work more diligently towards reducing the demand for drugs through the use of effective treatment programs. Doing this will cut off the lifeblood of these criminal organizations that take advantage of those struggling with addiction. Facing a growing number of opioid deaths in Tucson, we launched a program to prioritize drug treatment over incarceration. We now allow officers to use discretion in diverting suspects caught with small amounts of narcotics into treatment instead of jail. Suspects caught selling drugs or those with most felony warrants are obviously ineligible. This has broad public support and is helping us lower our jail population while at the same time getting addicts the treatment they need. I believe local police best serve our communities by leaving the enforcement of immigration laws to the federal government. Immigration enforcement at the local level irresponsibly diverts very limited resources that we critically need to keep our communities safe. Now, Tucson takes pride in being welcoming to all. We're not a sanctuary city, but we do work to maintain community confidence and trust in law enforcement. We want victims and witnesses, no matter their immigration status, to seek our help and cooperate with us to stop dangerous criminals. Recently, policing has become harder in many of our neighborhoods. The climate resulting from the current rhetoric and crackdown on immigrants undermines trust, and it poses major challenges to police officers. Aggressive federal enforcement, including courthouse arrests and other high-profile operations, terrify not only the undocumented, but their American-born family, friends, and coworkers. As a result, an already marginalized community is less inclined to turn to us, making it much harder to apprehend criminals. And of course, when crimes go unreported and unsolved, the cartels go unchecked and increase their power. Current efforts to force local police to take on federal immigration enforcement responsibilities only worsen this dynamic. In addition, efforts to strip federal grant funding from localities deemed to be uncooperative will leave cities with fewer resources, and that leads to increases in crime. Now, the members of this committee have the ability to set a new standard in law enforcement, one that creates a balanced approach to public safety that not only preserves cooperation between local law enforcement and the feds, but also between local police and immigrant communities. I encourage you to do so. Working together, I have no doubt that we can curb drug demand, combat the cartels, and make our communities safer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief. Dr. Salih.
Thank you, Chairman Cornyn. Thank you, Ranking Member Durbin, for the invitation to be here. It's a great honor to be here with you. I was asked to be at the links between the transnational crime organizations and migration, which are complex, and also to look a little bit at what the current moment of change with the government in Mexico might be in terms of what we can do to manage the border and manage migration together. So let me say that in terms of the links that exist, I mean, transnational crime activity, the biggest link between organized crime and migration is obviously that the wave we've seen of transnational crime in Mexico and Central America is at the base of the violence that people experience in their daily lives. They are not necessarily being preyed on by large transnational drug trafficking organizations, but the gangs and the smaller thuggish groups that prey on local communities get their resources, their weapons, and their legitimacy, above all, from their connections to the large transnational crime organizations. For the most part, migrant smuggling organizations are different from, this is a question the Senator asked earlier, are different from the transnational crime organizations. There are cases where some of the drug trafficking organizations have moved into migrant smuggling, but generally these are separate lines of business. But you do see the migrant smuggling organizations having to pay for access to smuggling points, and particularly to the border, to be able to get people through. And you have seen an increasing predatory forms of migrant smuggling as a result of some of these relationships as well. But these are utilitarian, situational, and varied relationships between the migrant smugglers and the TCOs. And finally, TCOs and migrant smugglers, I mean, as we've heard and as the Chief just said, they use different crossing routes. I mean, generally speaking, drug trafficking, the highest value drug trafficking happens at ports of entry. Almost all the major narcotics, high-value cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamines are crossing overwhelmingly through ports of entry. Almost all the seizures are at ports of entry, 80 to 90%. Marijuana does cross between ports of entry. Migrant smugglers overwhelmingly focus between ports of entry as well. But marijuana is going down significantly, so between ports of entry. So different smuggling routes. We have a strategic moment. I think this has been said by everyone on the panel in one way or another with the inauguration of a new government of Mexico. Senator Cornyn and I were there for the inauguration, as a matter of fact. It's a chance to restart our bilateral agenda on organized crime, but also look at strategic options for managing migration flows in different ways. And we've heard, you know, Mexico is going through a moment where their interests are converging somewhat with ours in different ways than were true before. Mexico is no longer a sender of migrants, of unauthorized migrants in the way it once was. Most Mexicans that come to the United States come through legal paths. As of November, actually, we heard this yesterday from Commissioner McAleenan, as of November, there were more Guatemalans who were apprehended at the border than Mexicans. First time that's happened. The number of Mexicans keeps going down. Mexico is increasingly a receiving country for migrants. Largest migrants actually from the United States, but also from Central America, and increasingly a transit country. And because of that, they begin to have similar questions that they're asking about their migration system to what we're asking. Not the same, and we shouldn't confuse it by thinking they necessarily want to do the same things we do, but beginning to have similar sets of issues they have to think about in terms of their immigration policy. The new government has put 4 ideas on the table of things that they want to do. The first is enhancing their asylum system. The Mexican asylum system only got about 3,000 applications 3 years ago. This year they'll have close to 30,000, 10-time increase. Completely overburdened. Sounds familiar, right? Sounds like our asylum system. It's huge, but this is just monumental. They say they're going to try and beef this up. This is something we should obviously want to help with. This is something we can work with them and UNHCR. It's to our advantage that more people want to apply for asylum in Mexico, and there's some evidence that a lot of these people actually stay in Mexico as well. Secondly, they've talked about creating an employment-based visa for Central Americans that would take people from Central America who want to work and put them in areas where there are labor shortages in Mexico. This is a big undertaking. I mean, it is one thing to say that they want to do this. It's another thing to do this and also do it in a way that doesn't compete with Mexican workers, or perhaps do it with a labor program that includes Mexicans as well as Central Americans in creating a visa. They haven't done this before, but this is an area where we certainly could partner. It is something we have some expertise in doing as well, and it's something that would obviously create a magnet for people to stay in Mexico. Third, they've talked about professionalizing, modernizing the National Migration Institute, which is modernizing their border control and their migration enforcement so that they both respect human rights and the highest standards of integrity, which has not always happened in the past, while also channeling people into legal channels and having real enforcement teeth. And finally, they've talked about, what Selena said, investing in Central America. These are all things that we should think about how we can partner with them. There are some opportunities for us as well to think about our asylum system. We have more than a border crisis and asylum crisis when it comes to migration. My colleague Doris Meisner, who ran INS under both Democratic and Republican administrations, has proposed a rule change that would allow asylum officers to make their first decisions, would speed up asylum processes. We can be both fair and timely in how we do this. We don't need to narrow asylum, we simply need to be timely in how we grant it. That would both allow people to be removed who don't qualify quickly, as well as allowing people relief who do qualify. And let me just say quickly, because I'm over time, there is a lot we can do with Mexico in terms of asylum, thinking about in-country processing in Mexico, working with UNHCR and the Mexican government. Tough to do, but possible. Think about in-country processing in Central America. We could think about going after the worst migrant smugglers who abuse migrants through extortion and kidnapping, something we haven't done as much in the past. Good for enforcement, good for human rights. But this is the moment both to do things to fix our asylum system, but also to start creative discussions with our neighbors about how we do this together. So thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot to work with based on the testimony we've heard so far. Let me start with you, Ambassador Noriega. You've had experience working on the Hill in U.S. in and around the U.S. government, and others have as well. But I'm trying to figure out what's the best place to start coming up with a plan. Again, I guess I'm fixated on Plan Colombia because it's the one successful model, although we got a country of 125 million or so people in Mexico, and obviously countries that have a lot of problems, even bigger problems in Central America. But I talked to Senator Feinstein about maybe some plan Central America, but my suggestion to her is let's not make it just narrow there, let's make it regional. But I'd be interested in your comments, Ambassador Wayne, in terms of how we approach this. Let me preface that by saying, until recently, my perception was that Mexico regarded illegal immigration into the United States is our problem, not their problem. And in fact, they gave transit visas. As long as people didn't stay in Mexico, they could just come on through. Same thing with drugs. They viewed that as our problem based on demand and not their problem. Although I don't know how you view it that way when you see the toll of violent deaths that are occurring there, which, as the professor said, are continuing to increase. So could you all maybe start, Professor Noriega, Ambassador Noriega, Ambassador Wayne, first talk about how should we conceptualize the framework so we're not just dealing with little one-off issues. How can we make this sort of a comprehensive plan? Should it emanate from the executive branch or from the legislative branch?
Well, thank you very much, Senator. I was working for Senator Helms when Plan Colombia was passed, but I started working on that under Ben Gilman, the chairman of the House International Relations Committee from New York, and for whom I worked for 4 years, and where I really dug in on these issues. He treated it as quite a priority. And then when I came over to the Senate side, I was one of the people that everybody trusted in the room among the staff, because I worked for both sides. And it was a Hill initiative. It was a congressional initiative. And you had folks like Dennis Hastert, Mark Souder, Ben Gilman take the lead on the House side. Over here, Paul Coverdell, Senator Dodd participated, and Senator Helms as well. And it was very much folks like the people sitting behind you who dug in on these issues and worked them for a long time and established good relationships with people, and who identified folks in Colombia that we could work with, and started sort of in a tactical approach. And then the folks in the State Department responded. Pete Romero took the ball and ran with this, and they helped the Colombians come up with an answer to the question, how do we have a response? So it was really both engaged, but it was Congress really pushing and insisting that we go with real money. As one of the chairmen at the time said, make no small plans. He challenged the State Department to come back with an aggressive plan, and frankly, the Congress increased the amounts and engaged. With Central America, there is a plan that's on the table really, and actually has been implemented. It was conceived with the help of the Inter-American Development Bank, and they put together a very comprehensive approach that the Central American countries are then matching with their own resources. And that made, so that's out there on the table. I would suggest that as you look at this problem, it's the global threat, the organized crime, which, by the way, drug trafficking only accounts for 40% of its $2.2 trillion income, really has us overwhelmed. And it's various actors have helped disintegrate institutions in Central America. 10 years ago, we passed the Central American Free Trade Agreement, talking about these countries as economic partners, and now they're basket cases again, because their political systems, their institutions, their police forces were overwhelmed by narco traffickers. So we have to use asymmetrical tools against those. It's not all about finding the cocaine and the marijuana and the heroin. We should find the lieutenant colonel with $200 million in his bank account and start asking questions. Sort of those asymmetrical sanctions that are being used by OFAC and FinCEN against Venezuela is in a very aggressive way by Marshall Billingsley, the Assistant Secretary over there, and start to kind of, with these rifle shots, pick off some of these kingpins so that maybe the people on the ground have a fighting chance. I've talked too long, but I'm sure.
No, I was hoping you would make it more narrow, and then you made it global. But I appreciate that. I understand what you were saying.
Excellent points, Roger.
Ambassador Wayne.
I think, of course, my career of 40 years being in the executive, what I've seen that has worked very well is to get in and really sit with the other governments and work nitty-gritty on the details. But it's been wonderful to have that conceptual support, when there has been the case, from Congress to help push this along, and that's often been the case. Sometimes, of course, it's been in the administration, sometimes in Congress, but if you can get both talking on the conceptual agreement and then work through the specifics with a partner government or partner governments, that really does make a difference. And what we have, the big change now is the arrival of this new government in Mexico. And while there are questions, as Roger pointed out, there's an opening to try to find a way to work with us on these issues. And there's a big conceptual idea that the United States, even Canada, Central America, and Mexico can work together. And we can tackle at the same time migration and crime and job creation in these places if we talk about it and work at it using a bunch of different tools. And we do have that range of tools. That's going to take a lot of hard, specific work, including with the Inter-American Development Bank, because they did develop a good plan for Central America, but this is now different. And Roger's exactly right that in some places, organized crime is just too powerful, and you have to target them, but you have to know each of the places, look at it, and use your tools in different ways. And if we could get this conceptual agreement, get support for it, get funding for it, and get everybody committed, I think over a number of years, we could make a big difference on all these problems using a multi-layered approach. Just like in migration, you've got to look at the root causes. You have to look at when they get to southern Mexico, what happens to them? Are there other options? How are they treated? Are they being abused by the criminal groups going up? Can we get rid of that? Thus, do we reduce the problem before it gets to our border? Then do we make some of our own changes in asylum procedures and other things to be more effective at our border? It's a whole layered approach that we could take to these problems, but it takes a big commitment, and it takes intellectual authorship and support in Congress as well as the administration. I think we have that opportunity, though.
Senator Durbin?
Chief Magnus, I looked at your resume: Lansing, Michigan, Fargo, North Dakota, Richmond, California, Tucson, Arizona. You've done quite a tour of this country. And now you're on a border city responsibility. And what I hear from you is what I hear from my superintendent, Eddie Johnson, up in Chicago, about how important it is for effective police work to have the trust of the community. And I couldn't agree with you more that if we try to put you into a federal role enforcing immigration, I don't think it's going to make it any easier. I think it's going to make it more complicated for you. Have you had the cooperation of your Hispanic community in Tucson when it comes to dealing with drug issues that we've talked about?
Senator, we certainly have, and one of the biggest reasons for that is this focus on relational policing, or really community policing, where we understand that we have to have that relationship with the entire community. Tucson is about 50% Hispanic, and many of the residents of Tucson are families who they are immigrants, and they have family, extended family, in some cases who are undocumented, sometimes even living in the same household with them. These are all people that make up the fabric of our community, and once we start tearing at that fabric in terms of creating a climate of fear where people are simply unwilling to talk to the police or even talk to their neighbors, sometimes not even willing to come out of the house because they're so afraid, all we do is we lower the level of safety for every resident of the city. So I think the climate we set is incredibly important for safety, and that means that we leave the civil immigration enforcement duties to our federal partners. We partner with them when appropriate on some of these larger challenges like drug cartels, the human trafficking, some of the other things, but on a day-to-day level, we have to be able to do our own work.
Dr. Seeley, we talked a lot about the Mexican cartels, and I'm just blown away by the notion that their volume of economic activity matches the GDP of Mexico, puts it in stark perspective. We haven't talked about the structure and relationship with the drug gangs in those three countries that are forcing so many people toward our border: Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. What can you tell me about that?
What we do know is that there is, in Central America, you have both the drug gangs, the Mexican transnational crime organization. We call them Mexican, but they are, because a lot of leadership is Mexican, but these are truly transnational organizations. As it became harder to operate in Mexico, they moved more of their operations into Guatemala and Honduras. Some of their operations were there already. And they also began teaming up with, smaller groups, right? Very agile groups. So MS-13, Barrio 18, the two Salvadoran gangs, a lot of local groups. I mean, when you get into Honduras and Guatemala, you do have some presence of those gangs, but you have a lot of local level gangs that work for the cartels, that work for the large transnational crime groups. And those are the groups that are particularly dangerous to people. And you see this in Mexico as well, by the way. I mean, the largest crime groups often are less predatory. They make their money in drugs. The smaller groups are the ones that mix between servicing the large cartels. They make money there, they get weapons there, but that's not necessarily always a full-time occupation, and so they spend a lot of their time doing things like extortion locally, kidnapping in Mexico more than in Central America.
Take a country like Guatemala.
Yeah.
I mean, to think that there are more Guatemalans showing up at our border.
It's incredible.
Than Mexicans. I mean, that's
Yeah.
a relatively small country. And
Yeah.
there's a distance to be traveled. And many of these are mothers with children who are making it up to our border. So it just sounds like it's pure chaos and disorder in Guatemala and a lot of fear. I can't imagine that it's just economic opportunity driving them. There has to be a climate down there that is fearful.
I think there's a mixture of things. Some people are leaving for economic reasons. There's some areas of drought and crop shortage. Some people are leaving for mixed motives. That's economic, but it's also the turbulence around them and the violence around them. And some people are leaving for really specific threats. I spent some time hanging out with 4 teenagers in the border, on the Mexican side of the border the other day, who all were able to list very specific things. And one young man brought up his Facebook page as we sat there. This was at a youth shelter in Tijuana, and literally just scrolled through his Facebook page, showing me everyone who had been killed. It was his news feed, basically, and he was going through and saying, I went to school with this person, this is the mother of one of my neighbors, this is just one after another. I mean, he completely monotone, by the way. He wasn't trying to shock me. He was simply making the point that, you know, this is kind of the way life is where he is, and he had received a very specific threat to his parents and simply decided never to go home again if he didn't join the gang. And he said, I left. You know, I went to a friend's house and left the next morning and never even told my parents I was leaving. That was the story of all 4 of them in one way or another, right? These were the specific gangs and local crime groups. Other people you talk to, it's land invasions, it's a lot of his extortion payments that people at some point simply can't make the payment one month, and they decide to, the month they can't make the payment, that they need to leave because they will be killed otherwise, or their kids will be killed. So
this sounds to me like credible fear.
There's a lot of that. I mean, you know, I would not say that everyone's in asylums. You know, I wouldn't say everyone is fleeing because of violence. I think there are economic motives, and we should try and begin to distinguish between people who need protection and people who, you know, we have a tendency either to say these people are all gaming the system, or these people are all, you know, people who need protection. There's a mixture in there, but I would say there's a large number of people who do need protection, and we don't have to choose in our system. I mean, we don't actually have to choose between being fair to people and having a deterrent. If we have a fair, effective, relatively expedited asylum system, not overly expedited, we have to give people due process, but not as sclerotic as it is right now where people wait for 2 or 3 years, we can make fair decisions quickly, and we can be fair and be as inclusive as possible of people that really fear going back, make sure we give them asylum, let them stay.
And the numbers on refugees and asylees have gone down dramatically.
Yes,
under
they
this
have.
administration.
They have.
Even though we face this on our border.
That's right, and we could be thinking about the refugee program, how we use the refugee program also for the Western Hemisphere, for people actually, so they don't have to make the journey up to the border.
Thank you very much. Well, and we also had that program which the administration discontinued.
That's correct.
Where minors could go to the embassy in their native country and make application for asylum.
That's right, the camp.
See whether or not they were approved, and it was eliminated.
It was eliminated. I mean, that is a real opportunity to build on what we learned from that. Try and do. It's not easy to do in-country processing. I mean, I think we should agree that it is. These things require some experimentation, but we have an experience doing this. It's something we could actually build on again. We know we have an experience that was somewhat successful in doing that, and we could also think with UNHCR and the Mexican government how we do this in the south of Mexico before people make the whole journey across. You know, can we take some people through the refugee program once they're in Mexico? Again, the Mexican government might have something to say about that, but I think it's the kind of thing they're open to talking about if we are.
Thank you.
Professor, I think you were the one talking about the level of violence in Mexico not getting better, getting worse. My understanding in one of my recent trips to Mexico City is that essentially if you commit a murder in Mexico that you're almost guaranteed not to be prosecuted. They end up calling that impunity, I guess is the sort of generic word. But is it true that the law enforcement and judicial departments or branches of the Mexican government are simply unable to bring people to any justice if they commit a murder in Mexico?
That's the problem that you have with impunity and corruption, is that actually the average citizen has very little faith in the police as well as the judicial system. So first you have very low levels of people who actually file reports and denounce is what they call it, let alone actually realize a conviction. And as you know, through the Merida initiative, the U.S. has been helping the Mexican government reform its judicial system, and then more importantly, change their prosecutorial method. But the real problem, too, is that you have, I think really when we're talking about situation in Central America, as well as what the different factors are, there are three. There's corruption and impunity, which are in one category. The wealth that these illicit activities generate that also feeds into the corruption. And then the third piece is the violence. What you're seeing is actual convergence of these three factors in the Northern Triangle. And to complement what Andrew was talking about is you actually have people migrating for fear of persecution, or that because their family was extorted and their relative didn't pay, it actually goes across not just the person who owed the money, but the whole family, as well as lack of economic opportunity. Both Ambassador Noriega and Ambassador Wayne referred to something called Alliance for Prosperity, which is this actual plan to generate, more importantly, opportunities for job creation and investment in the Northern Triangle.
In Central America?
In Central America. So we actually have a lot of the components. The bigger question is, how do you get the political will through the three, or corruption is a huge challenge in the Northern Triangle. You've actually just seen the brother of the sitting president of Honduras arrested for narcotics trafficking. The last government in Guatemala, many of them were trained and sponsored by the U.S., are also in jail for corruption charges. So there's a bigger piece of governance, which we haven't really talked about, but this bigger question of how do you get the local populations to trust the governments that we're entrusting in terms of foreign assistance and having the political will to fight the transnational criminal organizations, whether they be local gangs who really do feed off of extortion and use violence or the threat of violence, to the larger movers of illicit trafficking, whether it be people or drugs. The other thing I wanted to call it to attention was the fact that you have external actors that are involved now. So I spend a lot of time looking at money laundering, the amount of money being handled by Chinese TCOs as well as Chinese banks in order to circumvent sanctions, as well as our know your client regulations, is a new conduit. And I think you've seen, too, the rapprochement of the government of El Salvador with the Chinese regime is very troublesome. And one of the things what we're trying to figure out, I think it's a very useful time right now to reassess how we be the partner of choice and continue to be the BFF, the best friends forever, of Central America as well as Mexico at a very interesting juncture, particularly as we see these countries now looking for different ways that the Chinese are using predatory lending, most favored nation type of trade agreements with partners in the region that are actually trying to basically erode the influence that the U.S. has had through all the different portfolios, military, law enforcement, economic, and also the cultural ties that we have. And this is a really crucial point that we have to figure out how to double down on our investment. And it's not just about money. It's about the political will and commitment and how to build those relationships with a new team under AMLO in Mexico. Because now they are really engaging. They're now understanding what it's like to be a recipient and deal with all of these migrants that are in their communities without the actual experience that we've had in the U.S. And they don't have the level of NGOs that we have and the charitable tradition that we have in the U.S. to handle, and you see it every day with what's being streamed from Tijuana, and I think you were just down there. The physical capacity for them to handle these migrants is actually degrading their security, but also from a public health point of view, which is disturbing for everyone involved.
A couple of you have mentioned AMLO's commitment to a National Guard. I assume that this is just the latest iteration of the attempt to try to deal with the corruption problem at the local and the state level. I know over the years they've tried to federalize this, make it a national police, national law enforcement organization to deal with it that would be perhaps vetted and less susceptible to corruption. I assume that's the motivation for that. Is that correct, Ambassador Wayne?
I think it is. As you know, for this century, they've been struggling,
with the ability to really have a fully coordinated overall strategy that worked and have all the different parts of their government working together, federal, state, and local. They have not successfully done that under the last two presidents. So they came up with this idea of a National Guard because the least corrupted, not uncorrupted, but the least corrupted were the Defense Department entities, the Army and the Navy.
But I know there are a lot of the NGOs and others that object to the military basically doing police work. And I can understand that. But as you point out, they are the ones that are most effective and least subject to corruption. But I guess you still have the basic problem at the local and state level of, what is it, plata o plomo?
Yes.
Silver or lead.
That's
and
it.
You can see how the sort of intimidation tactics and that are used to undermine public authority and order in those countries. Dr. Saleh, let me make sure I understood. Are you saying that the migrant smugglers are not transnational criminal organizations, or are you saying somehow they're separate, or?
Yeah, just that they're separate from the migrant smugglers tend to be different from the drug traffickers.
So you
Smaller.
you don't agree with those who say that the cartels are essentially commodity agnostic? That
No.
Whatever will make them money?
No, I think the drug traffickers, for the most part, I mean, there have been attempts. The Zetas actually got into some migrant smuggling. We know the Tijuana cartel at one point got in, but the Tijuana cartel, when they were really on their heels, when they were losing some of their drug business, and the Juarez cartel at a time where they were losing some of their drug business, moved into migrant smuggling to supplement. But for the most part, for them, drugs is a big successful business. And they get a lot more out of being able to charge the derecho de piso, as they call it, the right to cross, without having to get into the complexities of running a different business venture. And so I don't think it's a moral question in any way. I mean, it's not that they wouldn't get into it. It's just a specialized business. They're slightly smaller groups. They're still larger. I mean, gone is the day when there are mom and pop smugglers, right? Which used to, I lived in the border on the Mexican side in the 1990s. You still had the mom and pop smugglers, or usually, actually, I live near a father and son smuggling team at one point. I mean, these, that's gone. These are criminal enterprises now, but they are, for the most part, separate today than the larger drug organizations. And one of the things that I think, if I can jump into the last question as well, I think you have seen some successes in parts of Mexico where you do have better policing and better courts in some areas, and some cities are safer, and you do have citizen vigilance of what government does, and Mexico's become a real patchwork. There's some places have gotten worse, and some places have gotten better, and there's a lot we can learn from the places that have gotten better in terms of local law enforcement.
Can you confirm that basically the cartels control all of the real estate that's contiguous to the U.S. border? I guess, and that's where they make you pay to cross. But my understanding, and this is kind of a chilling number, is that the cartels and the criminal organizations basically control more than a third of the country. Even though it's the 11th largest economy in the world, that doesn't really tell the story when the Mexican government and the state government, local government, can't even control large swaths of real estate in the country.
It's interesting what control means, because there was a time, the Zetas started a business model where control meant really having a heavy-handed control of lots of things moving around them. The contrasting model is the Sinaloa cartel, which really is all about trafficking drugs and buying off what you need of the state. So if what you need is in a certain area, you need the chief of police, with all due respect to my colleague here, but I mean, if what you need is you're trafficking, in Sinaloa, and you need the chief of police of a municipality, you go for the chief of police, but you don't worry about other businesses, right? You don't go for the superintendent of schools. The Zetas really got into trying to do more. They tried to control lots of things. It failed. The Mexican government went after them with U.S. support and really degraded them, and there are pieces of Zetas left, but there's no big Zetas organization anymore. For the most part, Mexican organizations, the largest ones are about trafficking drugs. Some of the smaller ones, and in parts of the country, they do try and exercise. If you go to Guerrero, if you go to parts of Oaxaca and Veracruz, there are Tamaulipas, there are groups that really try and control more than just drug trafficking. But I say that only because when a third of the country probably has really active cartels, but it means something different in a city like Monterrey, where you can live your life daily and never notice the cartels, than if you live in a town like Chilpancingo, Guerrero, where it would be very hard to run a small business without paying a tax to the cartels.
Senator, if I could just jump in on
Please.
When people refer to this controlling territory, and they're basically, they control it from one another. They divide up turf, and if you want to challenge another cartel, you know, blood is expensive, and so they generally respect the right to move material and within certain geographical areas. With respect to a couple things, the corruption issue. When President Felipe Calderon, who I'm sure you've had a good relationship with over the years, initially took this on, in retrospect, what he encountered was there was so much corruption at the state and local level, where people not only defied the federal government when he was trying to move against certain targets. In certain cases, they were in bed with the narcos, the local, state and local leaders. And he would, you know, replace them and that sort of thing. But it's really hard to get traction with this kind of top-down approach. Mexico needs a cultural change in terms of corruption and accountability and transparency, and it's this extraordinarily complicated and time-consuming process. But there has to be a certain change in expectations from the top down, and I think AMLO could do that, quite frankly. He has a mandate to do precisely that, but it requires a criminal justice reform, penitentiary reform, professionalization of the police. Only a handful of Mexico's 31 states has the capacity to, you know, even a professional track for policing. So there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done, but it really requires political will. AMLO's kind of an outsider in certain respects, but the ultimate insider in others. But he's sort of a maverick, and so perhaps he can challenge the structural corruption that's existed in Mexico for many, many years, and which has blocked progress in terms of economic advancement, and now blocked, simple application of the rule of law and the protection of citizens. And AMLO perhaps can change that, transform that model.
I agree that it looks like he's a unique political figure. He does seem to have a mandate to deal with corruption and the violence. Whether he can actually do that or not, I don't know. And that's where I think we can try to find a way to share that challenge, because it affects them and us and Central America too. And so we're trying to get our head around all of that and figure out how to take advantage of the moment and the opportunity this may provide. My impression of President Lopez Obrador's speech that he gave at his inaugural, as I understood it by translation, is that he raised expectations sky high. And ordinarily you try to tamp down expectations and exceed those low expectations, in my experience, but he set expectations very high. So it's going to be interesting to see. We have a lot of skin in the game ourselves here in the United States in terms of how that turns out, and we need to figure a way to work with our Mexican counterparts at the legislative and executive branch level and help them in all the ways you all have detailed. Well, thank you for spending your time here and sharing your expertise with us. This hearing is now adjourned. What we will do, I will just add by way of footnote, there may be some additional written questions. I wouldn't expect a lot, but we'll go ahead and give everybody a chance if they have additional areas they want to inquire about, and then we'll close out the record in about 10 days, 2 weeks' time. So thank you very much.
Great to meet you. Yeah, great. Thanks.